Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might lull you into the deepest sleep of your life, the utterly soul, crushing reality of medieval pilgrimage survival. We're diving into what life was really like for the thousands of people who thought walking 800 miles through medieval Europe was somehow a good idea. Forget the romantic spiritual journey Hollywood sold you. Those were the tales written by the lucky few who actually survived to tell about it. The truth is, if you were dropped onto the Camino de Santiago in 1200, you probably wouldn't last 24 hours, let alone the 3 months it took to complete the journey. You'd be dead faster than a medieval rumor spreads through a monastery. And believe me, that's pretty fast when everyone's bored and there's no internet to scroll through. So before you get comfortable in your modern bed with its miracle of thread counts and climate control, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, as we explore the lives of people who never got to travel beyond their village unless they were willing to risk everything for salvation. Because GPS wasn't invented yet and getting lost meant becoming dinner for wolves or bandits, whichever found you first. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on some white noise for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A journey through mud, disease, and the kind of survival that makes modern extreme sports look like a leisurely stroll through your local mall. You wake up in the year 1205. The sun hasn't risen yet. The rooster outside your window won't shut up. Your back aches from sleeping on what medieval people generously called a mattress, but what you would recognize as a sack of straw that's seen better decades. The straw pokes through the rough fabric. Every movement creates a symphony of crunching sounds. Your pillow is essentially a smaller sack of the same straw. Luxury was not a concept that applied to sleeping arrangements. Your wife shakes you awake. Her name is Marguerite. She's 28 years old, which makes her practically ancient by medieval standards. Most women her age have already buried at least 2 children. She's been lucky so far. Only one of your 4 children died in infancy. The other 3 are still breathing, which is about as much as you can hope for in an era where childhood diseases kill more efficiently than medieval warfare. Guillaume, she whispers, using your name with the kind of urgency that suggests something terrible has happened. In medieval times, urgency usually meant death, disease, or tax collectors, sometimes all 3 at once. The fever broke during the night. You sit up too quickly. The world spins. Medieval diets weren't exactly known for providing the nutrients needed for sudden movements. Your youngest son, Pierre, has been sick for a week. High fever, vomiting, the kind of symptoms that medieval medicine treated with bloodletting and prayers. Both methods were equally effective, which is to say not at all. But the fever breaking is good news. It means Pierre might live to see his 6th birthday. In medieval Europe, reaching age 6 was like completing your first major life achievement. Most children didn't make it that far. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and basic lack of medical knowledge killed children faster than parents could name them. Some families didn't even bother naming children until they turned 2. Why get attached to something that probably wouldn't survive winter? You stumble out of bed. Your feet hit the cold dirt floor. Yes, dirt. Wooden floors were for rich people. Stone floors were for really rich people. Carpets existed only in the fevered dreams of people who had never seen one. Your house has 2 rooms, one for sleeping, one for everything else. Privacy was a luxury concept that wouldn't be invented for several more centuries. The everything else room contains your entire worldly possessions. A wooden table, 2 benches, a chest that contains your good clothes, meaning the clothes with fewer holes, a few clay pots for cooking, some wooden bowls and spoons. Metal utensils were expensive. Forks hadn't been invented yet for common people. You ate with your hands or with wooden spoons that gave every meal a subtle woody flavor. Marguerite is already preparing breakfast. Breakfast consists of bread and porridge, not the hearty, filling bread you're imagining. Medieval peasant bread was made from whatever grains were available mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, and sometimes sand for texture. The porridge is made from oats that have seen better months. Everything tastes vaguely of mold because everything is slightly moldy. Food preservation hadn't quite mastered the art of keeping things fresh beyond hope for the best. You eat quickly, not because you're hungry, although you always are. Medieval peasants lived in a constant state of mild starvation, punctuated by brief moments of having enough food. You eat quickly because today is the day you've been planning for months. Today you begin your pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Why would anyone voluntarily walk 800 miles through medieval Europe? Because your immortal soul depends on it. Or at least that's what the church told you. The church had very strong opinions about immortal souls and very specific ideas about how to save them. Pilgrimage was one of the approved methods. The other methods included tithing, which you couldn't afford, and joining the Crusades, which had an even lower survival rate than pilgrimage. Your local priest, Father Bernard, explained it to you last month. He's a thin man with breath that could kill plants. Medieval dental hygiene was about as advanced as medieval aviation, which hadn't been invented yet. Father Bernard told you that walking to Santiago would earn you a plenary indulgence. This meant all your sins would be forgiven. Every lie you've told, every time you've coveted your neighbor's slightly better cow, every impure thought you've had about the baker's daughter, all forgiven as long as you survived the journey. The survival part was the tricky bit. Medieval pilgrimage routes were essentially obstacle courses designed by people who wanted to test your faith by seeing how much suffering you could endure. The route to Santiago passed through mountains, forests, rivers, and bandit-infested territories. It was like a medieval version of an extreme sport, except the only prize was not going to hell. You finish your breakfast. Marguerite hands you a leather bag. Inside is everything you'll need for the next 3 months. A change of clothes, a wooden bowl, a spoon, some dried bread that's already harder than most rocks, a small knife that's more useful for eating than fighting, a water skin made from animal bladder that still smells faintly of whatever animal it came from, and a leather purse containing your life savings, 3 silver coins and 17 copper pennies. This represents 20 years of saving every spare coin you could manage. Medieval pilgrims weren't exactly traveling in luxury. You couldn't book a hotel room or grab dinner at a restaurant. Inns existed, but they were expensive and often more dangerous than sleeping outdoors. Restaurant culture hadn't been invented yet. Fast food meant catching something that couldn't run away quickly. Your accommodation options were limited to monastery guest houses, the homes of charitable Christians, or wherever you could find shelter that didn't already contain something trying to eat you. Your children gather around to say goodbye. Your oldest daughter, Marie, is 13. She's already married to the blacksmith's son. Medieval people got married young because life expectancy was low and there wasn't time for extended courtship periods. Marie cries as she hugs you. She knows there's a good chance she'll never see you again. Medieval pilgrimage had a mortality rate that would make modern extreme sports look like knitting circles. Your son Henry is 11. He wants to come with you. He doesn't understand that pilgrimage isn't an adventure. It's a survival challenge where the obstacles include starvation, disease, bandits, wild animals, and weather that can kill you in dozens of creative ways. You ruffle his hair and promise to bring him back something from Santiago. You don't mention that the most likely souvenir would be news of your death delivered by another pilgrim who happened to witness it. Little Pierre, the one who just recovered from fever, clings to your leg. He's too young to understand what's happening. He just knows Papa is leaving for a long time. Medieval children learned early that adults disappeared sometimes. Death was a constant presence in medieval life. It wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. It happened in your house, in your street, in your daily experience. Children grew up understanding that life was fragile and people you loved could vanish without warning. You kiss Marguerite goodbye. She doesn't cry. Medieval women learned early that crying didn't change anything. She hands you a small wooden cross. She carved it herself from a piece of oak. It's crude but functional. It will serve as your pilgrim badge. proving that you're on a religious journey and not just wandering around the countryside for suspicious reasons. Medieval authorities were very concerned about people wandering around without good reasons. You step outside your house. The sun is just beginning to rise. The air is crisp with the kind of cold that medieval clothing was designed to ignore rather than prevent. Your outfit consists of a rough wool tunic, leather breeches, wool stockings, and leather shoes that will last about 50 miles before falling apart completely. Medieval cobbling was more art than science, and the art involved using whatever materials were available, regardless of their suitability for walking long distances. Your walking stick is a piece of ash wood you cut and shaped yourself. It's about shoulder height with a simple leather strap. This stick will become your most important possession over the next 3 months. It will help you walk. It will help you climb. It will serve as a weapon when necessary. It will be your support when illness makes walking difficult. Medieval pilgrims developed deep emotional relationships with their walking sticks. Losing your stick was almost as bad as losing your money. The village streets are empty, except for the occasional pig rooting through garbage. Medieval waste management consisted of throwing everything into the street and hoping it would eventually decompose or wash away in the next heavy rain. The smell is indescribable. Imagine the worst garbage you've ever smelled, then multiply it by centuries of accumulated waste products from humans and animals living in close proximity without modern sanitation. You walk past the church where Father Bernard is probably preparing for morning prayers. The church is the largest building in your village. It's also the only stone building. Everything else is wood, thatch, and hope. The church bell tower looms over the village like a stone finger pointing toward heaven, or towards Santiago de Compostela, which amounts to the same thing in medieval religious thinking. Your route begins by following the old Roman road south. The Romans built roads that lasted centuries. Medieval road maintenance consisted of hoping the Roman roads would continue lasting centuries. When Roman roads weren't available, medieval roads were essentially paths that enough people had walked to create ruts in the dirt. These paths followed the contours of the land, which meant going around every hill, following every river bend, and taking the longest possible route between any 2 points. The first person you encounter is Thomas the Miller. He's also beginning his pilgrimage today. Thomas is 45 years old, which makes him practically a medieval senior citizen. Most men his age were dead or dying. Thomas survived this long because millers were essential to village life and tended to eat better than average peasants. Better nutrition meant better survival rates, though better is relative when you're comparing various degrees of malnutrition. "Guillaume," Thomas calls out. His voice echoes in the empty street. "Ready for our grand adventure?" Thomas has an optimistic personality that will be thoroughly crushed by reality within the first week. Medieval pilgrimage had a way of destroying optimism faster than winter destroyed crops. But today, Thomas is excited. He's been planning this pilgrimage for 5 years. He saved money, arranged for his mill to be managed by his nephew, and convinced his wife that walking to Santiago was preferable to staying home and dying of old age. "As ready as anyone can be for possible death," you reply. Medieval humor tended toward the morbid. When death was a constant possibility, jokes about death became a coping mechanism. Plus, medieval entertainment options were limited. Joking about mortality was free entertainment that didn't require any equipment or special skills. You and Thomas begin walking south. The early morning air is crisp and clean, relatively speaking. Medieval air quality was terrible by modern standards, but breathable by medieval standards. The constant burning of wood for cooking and heating created a permanent haze over most settlements. Add in the smoke from various crafts like blacksmithing and pottery, and medieval air had a distinctive flavor that would trigger modern air quality alerts. The path leads through fields where crops are growing. Medieval agriculture operated on the 3-field system. One field grew crops, one field grew different crops, and one field lay fallow to recover. This system prevented complete soil exhaustion, but didn't prevent periodic famines when weather conditions were bad. Medieval peasants lived one bad harvest away from starvation. Every growing season was a gamble, with death as the stakes. After walking for 2 hours, you encounter your first fellow pilgrims, a group of 5 people from a village 20 miles north. They started their journey yesterday and camped by the road overnight. Medieval camping involved finding a spot that seemed unlikely to contain bandits, wild animals, or ghosts. Ghost avoidance was a serious concern. Medieval people believed ghosts were everywhere and had strong opinions about disturbing them. The group consists of 2 married couples and an elderly man traveling alone. The elderly man introduces himself as Brother Antoine. He's not actually a monk, but he likes the title. Medieval people were casual about religious titles. Anyone who could read Latin and owned a Bible could claim clerical status. Literacy was rare enough that few people questioned religious credentials. "Blessings upon your journey," Brother Antoine says in Latin. Then he repeats it in French because most people don't speak Latin. Medieval Latin was the language of education and religion, but education was limited to clergy and wealthy nobles. Everyone else spoke whatever local dialect had evolved from centuries of linguistic drift and foreign invasions. The 2 married couples are both from the same village. The first couple, Jean and Isabel, are in their 30s. They've been married for 15 years and have 6 children. 4 of their children are still alive, which represents excellent child-rearing success by medieval standards. They're making this pilgrimage because Isabel nearly died in childbirth with their youngest. Medieval childbirth was essentially a life-or-death gamble. Medical understanding of pregnancy and delivery was limited to folk remedies and hoping for divine intervention. The second couple, Robert and Agnes, are younger. Robert is 22, Agnes is 19. They've been married for 2 years and don't have children yet. This is either excellent timing or a sign of fertility problems. Medieval medicine had no understanding of fertility beyond have sex and pray. Contraception existed in the form of various herbal remedies that were about as effective as medieval aviation. Your group of 7 begins walking together. Medieval pilgrimage was safer in groups. Bandits were less likely to attack large groups of armed pilgrims. Wild animals preferred easier prey. Plus, group travel provided entertainment during long hours of walking. Medieval people were excellent storytellers because storytelling was one of the few entertainment options available during long winter nights or tedious journeys. The conversation starts with introductions and explanations of why everyone decided to risk death by pilgrimage. Thomas the Miller is seeking forgiveness for charging excessive prices during the last famine. Medieval commerce operated on Christian principles that forbade profiteering, but starving people paid whatever prices were demanded. Thomas's conscience has been bothering him for 3 years. Brother Antoine is making this pilgrimage because he promised his dying wife he would walk to Santiago if she recovered from her illness. She didn't recover. Now he's fulfilling his promise anyway because medieval people took promises seriously, especially promises made to dying spouses. Medieval marriage was often brief due to high mortality rates, but the emotional bonds were intense. Jean and Isabel are walking to Santiago because their village priest told them it would guarantee safe childbirth for any future pregnancies. Medieval religious advice often involved extensive physical hardship as proof of spiritual dedication. The logic was that God preferred people who were willing to suffer for their faith. Medieval Christianity was big on suffering as spiritual currency. Robert and Agnes are seeking a blessing for fertility. They've been married for 2 years without children, which medieval people interpreted as either divine punishment or demonic interference. Medieval understanding of reproduction was limited to folk beliefs and religious explanations. Medical knowledge consisted mainly of bloodletting and herbal remedies that were equally effective for all conditions, meaning not effective at all. You explain that you're making this pilgrimage because your youngest son nearly died from fever. You promised God that if Pierre survived, you would walk to Santiago in gratitude. Medieval people made bargains with God frequently. These bargains usually involved promising to do something difficult or expensive in exchange for divine intervention. The promises were considered binding even if the desired outcome didn't occur. The road begins climbing into hills. Medieval roads followed natural contours because medieval engineering couldn't afford to cut through obstacles. Every hill meant going up and over rather than around or through. Your legs begin aching after the first major climb. Medieval life involved constant physical labor, but pilgrimage required different muscles than farming or craft work. Long-distance walking used muscle groups that normal medieval activities didn't develop. By midday, the sun is hot enough to make wool clothing uncomfortable. Medieval clothing was designed for durability rather than comfort. Wool was the primary fabric because it was available, relatively inexpensive, and provided insulation. Cotton wasn't available in medieval Europe. Silk was imported from distant lands and cost more than most people earned in a year. Linen was available but expensive. Most people owned 1 or 2 sets of clothes and wore them until they fell apart. Your group stops for lunch by a stream. Medieval hygiene involved washing in whatever water was available when you had time to spare. Daily bathing wasn't practical for people who owned limited clothing and had limited access to soap. Medieval soap was made from animal fat and ash. It cleaned effectively but smelled terrible and was harsh on skin. Most people washed their hands and faces regularly, but full-body bathing was reserved for special occasions. Lunch consists of bread, dried meat, and whatever edible plants can be found growing wild. Medieval cuisine relied heavily on forage foods. Peasants supplemented their diet with nuts, berries, wild greens, and anything else that wouldn't poison them. Mushroom identification was a critical survival skill. Wrong mushrooms meant death. Right mushrooms meant slightly less hunger. Brother Antoine produces a small leather pouch containing salt. Salt was expensive in medieval Europe because it had to be transported from coastal areas or salt mines. Inland communities paid premium prices for salt, which was essential for food preservation and flavor enhancement. Brother Antoine sharing his salt with the group is a significant gesture of generosity. This salt comes from the Bay of Bourgneuve, Brother Antoine explains. I traded a month's worth of eggs for this much. Medieval economy operated on barter systems in rural areas. Coins existed but were often scarce. Most transactions involved trading goods and services. A month's worth of eggs represented substantial wealth for someone who owned chickens. The afternoon walking becomes more difficult. The hills are steeper and the road is rougher. Medieval road maintenance was sporadic and depended on local lords who may or may not have cared about road conditions. Some lords maintained roads to encourage trade and travel through their territories. Other lords let roads deteriorate because they had more pressing concerns like warfare, taxation, or preventing their peasants from revolting. Your feet begin developing blisters. Medieval shoes were functional but not comfortable. Leather construction was basic. Cushioning didn't exist. Proper fit was a luxury. Most people wore shoes that were close enough to the right size and hoped for the best. Blisters were inevitable during long-distance walking. Medieval pilgrims developed elaborate blister management techniques involving various animal fats and herbal remedies. Agnes, the younger woman, begins limping. Her shoes are wearing through at the heel. Medieval women's shoes were often less sturdy than men's shoes because women were expected to walk shorter distances. Pilgrimage was physically demanding in ways that normal medieval life didn't prepare people for, especially women who spent most of their time doing indoor work. Robert examines his wife's shoes. The leather has cracked and separated from the sole. This is a serious problem only 3 days into a 3-month journey. Without proper footwear, Agnes won't be able to continue walking. Medieval shoe repair required specific tools and materials that traveling pilgrims didn't carry. Finding a cobbler along the pilgrimage route would be expensive and time-consuming. We need to find a village with a cobbler, Robert says. His voice contains the kind of worry that medieval people developed when facing problems they couldn't solve with available resources. Medieval life required constant problem-solving with limited tools and materials. Complex problems often had no good solutions. Thomas the miller pulls out his pack and examines his own shoes. The leather is still intact, but showing signs of wear. Medieval pilgrims learned to inspect their equipment regularly because equipment failure in remote areas could be fatal. Preventive maintenance was more important than repair because repair might not be possible when needed. Your group decides to alter course toward a village that supposedly has a cobbler. Medieval navigation relied on local knowledge and word-of-mouth directions. Maps existed but were rare and often inaccurate. Most people navigated by landmarks, road signs when they existed, and asking directions from anyone they encountered. Getting lost was a constant possibility. The detour adds 5 miles to your day's journey. Medieval pilgrims walked between 15 and 20 miles per day when conditions were good. Bad weather, difficult terrain, or equipment problems could reduce daily progress significantly. Every delay meant more days on the road, which meant more expenses and more opportunities for things to go wrong. The village you're seeking turns out to be smaller than expected. Medieval villages ranged from tiny settlements with a few dozen people to larger towns with several hundred residents. Size didn't always correlate with available services. Some small villages had specialized craftsmen who served surrounding areas. Other larger towns had no one with specific skills you might need. The cobbler is an elderly man named Martin who works out of a small workshop attached to his house. Medieval craftsmen lived and worked in the same buildings. Workshop space was usually the ground floor, living space was upstairs. This arrangement was efficient, but meant that work smells, sounds, and activities were part of daily domestic life. Martin examines Agnes's shoes with the practiced eye of someone who has spent decades working with leather. Medieval craftsmen developed expertise through apprenticeship systems that began in childhood and continued for years. Master craftsmen had knowledge and skills that were passed down through generations of specialized training. These shoes were made poorly, Martin announces. Medieval quality control was inconsistent. Some craftsmen took pride in their work and created durable products. Others prioritized speed and profit over durability. Customers had limited recourse when products failed because warranty concepts didn't exist, and returning defective goods was often impractical. "I can repair them, but it will take 2 days and cost 4 silver coins," Martin continues. Medieval craftsmen charged prices based on materials, time, and local economic conditions. 4 silver coins represented more money than most pilgrims budgeted for equipment repairs. The cost would strain your group's collective resources. Agnes begins crying. Medieval women were allowed to express emotions more freely than men, but crying in public was still considered embarrassing. Agnes is crying not just from frustration, but from fear that her shoe problems will force the entire group to abandon their pilgrimage. Medieval group dynamics required everyone to contribute and keep pace. Members who couldn't maintain group standards were often left behind. Robert counts his money. He has 8 silver coins and 30 copper pennies. This represents his family's life savings. Spending half their money on shoe repair 3 days into the journey would leave them with barely enough to complete the pilgrimage. Medieval financial planning was simple but harsh. When money ran out, you either found ways to earn more or accepted that your plans were impossible. Thomas the Miller offers to contribute 2 silver coins toward the repair cost. Medieval pilgrims often shared expenses when group members faced financial difficulties. Helping fellow pilgrims was considered a religious duty and practical necessity. Groups that abandoned members in difficulty often found themselves abandoned when they faced their own problems. Brother Antoine contributes 1 silver coin. You contribute 1 silver coin. Jean offers to contribute the 4th silver coin needed for the repair. Medieval group economics operated on mutual aid principles. Everyone understood that individual problems could become group problems if not addressed quickly. Martin begins working on the shoe repair. Medieval leatherwork involved cutting, stitching, and shaping using hand tools that hadn't changed significantly for centuries. The process was slow and labor-intensive. Martin works by candlelight because his workshop has only 1 small window. Medieval workshops were often dark, poorly ventilated, and cramped. While waiting for the shoe repair, your group stays in the village for 2 days. Accommodation consists of sleeping in the church. Medieval churches served as hostels for pilgrims who couldn't afford inn-rooms. Church hospitality was considered a religious obligation, but comfort was minimal. You sleep on stone floors with whatever bedding you brought with you. The church is dedicated to Saint Martin, the patron saint of soldiers and beggars. Medieval churches were usually dedicated to saints who had particular relevance to local communities or who were believed to provide specific types of divine protection. St. Martin was popular along pilgrimage routes because he was associated with helping travelers and poor people. The village priest, Father Jean, provides your group with information about the road ahead. Medieval priests served as information centers for travelers because they received news from other travelers and maintained correspondence with priests in distant areas. Father Jean warns your group about recent bandit activity in the forest 15 miles south. 3 pilgrims were robbed and beaten last week, Father Jean explains. The bandits took everything, including their clothes. The pilgrims arrived here naked and bleeding. Medieval bandit attacks were common and brutal. Bandits weren't romantic outlaws fighting injustice. They were desperate people who survived by taking whatever they could from anyone they could overpower. Brother Antoine asks about alternative routes. Medieval roads often had multiple paths between destinations. Some routes were safer but longer. Others were shorter but more dangerous. Route selection required balancing time, distance, safety, and available resources. There were no good choices, only different types of risks. Father Jean suggests a detour that adds 20 miles but avoids the forest where bandits are active. The detour passes through 3 villages with churches that provide pilgrim accommodation. Medieval pilgrimage routes were planned around available shelter and safety rather than efficiency. Surviving the journey was more important than completing it quickly. Your group discusses the route options. Thomas the miller favors the shorter, more dangerous route because he's worried about his mill being managed properly in his absence. Medieval business owners who traveled faced the constant worry that their businesses would fail or be mismanaged while they were away. Extended absence often meant financial ruin. Jean and Isabel prefer the safer, longer route because they have 4 children waiting for their return. Medieval parents who undertook dangerous journeys faced the terrible possibility of leaving their children orphaned. Orphaned children often became beggars or died of starvation because medieval social services consisted mainly of charity from relatives or religious organizations. Robert and Agnes want to take whichever route costs less money. Their shoe repair expense has left them with minimal resources for the rest of the journey. Medieval pilgrims who ran out of money faced the choice of begging, working along the route, or abandoning their pilgrimage. All options involved hardship and uncertainty. Brother Antoine suggests that the group should stay together, regardless of which route they choose. Medieval group travel provided safety and mutual aid that individual travelers couldn't achieve alone. Splitting up would leave everyone more vulnerable to bandits, wild animals, and other hazards. After lengthy discussion, the group decides on the longer, safer route. Medieval decision-making processes were slow and involved extensive consultation because wrong decisions could be fatal. Everyone had to agree on major route changes because everyone's life depended on group decisions. The shoe repair is completed successfully. Martin's work is skillful and thorough. The repaired shoes look better than they did when new. Medieval master craftsmen took pride in their work and often improved items while repairing them. Martin adds extra stitching and leather reinforcement that should prevent future problems. Agnes tries on her repaired shoes. The fit is better than before because Martin adjusted the sizing while doing the repair. Medieval craftsmen often made improvements beyond what customers requested because their reputation depended on satisfied customers who would recommend their services to other travelers. Your group prepares to leave the village. The 2-day delay has cost money and time, but everyone agrees that proper footwear is essential for completing the pilgrimage. Medieval travel required constant equipment maintenance and replacement. Attempting to continue with defective equipment was false economy that usually led to more expensive problems later. Father Jean blesses your group before departure. Medieval religious blessings were considered essential for safe travel. The blessing includes prayers for protection from bandits, wild animals, illness, and accidents. Medieval people believed that divine protection was available, but had to be requested through proper religious observances. The road out of the village leads through farmland where peasants are working in fields. Medieval agriculture was labor-intensive and required entire families to work during planting and harvest seasons. Children, as young as 5 years old, had responsibilities for tending animals, weeding crops, and helping with harvest activities. Your group waves to the farmers as you pass. Medieval social customs required acknowledging other people you encountered during travel. Ignoring other travelers was considered rude and potentially dangerous. People who acted suspiciously were often reported to local authorities as possible bandits or criminals. The detour route follows a river valley. Medieval roads often followed rivers because river valleys provided flatter terrain and reliable water sources. Rivers also served as navigation aids and transportation routes for goods that were too heavy or bulky for overland transport. River crossings were potential bottlenecks, where bandits sometimes waited for victims. Your first river crossing is at a stone bridge built by Romans centuries earlier. Roman engineering was superior to medieval engineering in most respects. Roman bridges, roads, and aqueducts often remained functional long after the Roman Empire collapsed. Medieval communities maintained Roman infrastructure when possible, but lacked the engineering knowledge to build comparable replacements. The bridge has a small chapel at one end. Medieval bridges often had religious structures because river crossings were considered dangerous places where divine protection was especially needed. Bridge chapels also served as toll collection points, where travelers paid fees for bridge maintenance. A monk sits outside the chapel, collecting tolls from travelers. Medieval toll collection was common on bridges, at river fords, and at mountain passes. Toll collectors were supposed to use the money for infrastructure maintenance, but corruption was common. Some toll collectors were legitimate religious authorities. Others were bandits who had claimed unofficial authority over river crossings. Brother Antoine approaches the monk to negotiate toll payments for your group. Medieval toll negotiations were complex because rates varied based on the type of traveler, size of group, and local political conditions. Pilgrims often received reduced rates, but they had to prove their pilgrim status and negotiate effectively. The monk examines your pilgrim badges and crosses. Medieval pilgrim identification was important for receiving religious hospitality and reduced toll rates. Fake pilgrims sometimes traveled pilgrimage routes to take advantage of charitable services intended for genuine religious travelers. Monks and priests developed expertise in identifying authentic pilgrims. Pilgrims pay half rate, the monk announces. 2 copper pennies per person. Medieval toll rates were usually reasonable for local traffic but could be expensive for long-distance travelers who encountered multiple toll points. Your group's toll payment totals 14 copper pennies, which is manageable but adds to your growing expenses. Thomas the Miller complains about toll payments. Medieval travelers often resented tolls because they seemed like arbitrary taxation by people who had done nothing to earn the money. However, refusing to pay tolls could result in being denied passage or reported to local authorities as troublemakers. The monk explains that toll money supports bridge maintenance and provides food for poor pilgrims who can't afford to pay for accommodation. Medieval religious institutions were expected to provide charity for travelers in need. Tolls from paying customers subsidized free services for people who couldn't afford to pay. Your group crosses the stone bridge. The river below is clear and fast-moving. Medieval rivers were generally cleaner than modern rivers because industrial pollution didn't exist yet. However, rivers were still dangerous due to swift currents, seasonal flooding, and the fact that most medieval people couldn't swim. Drowning was a common cause of accidental death. On the far side of the bridge, the road enters a forest. Medieval forests were darker and more dangerous than modern forests. Trees grew more densely because medieval forest management was limited. Undergrowth was thicker because there were fewer domestic animals grazing in forest areas. Forests provided hiding places for bandits, wolves, and other threats. Your group walks closer together when entering the forest. Medieval forest travel required extra caution and group coordination. Bandits preferred to attack travelers in wooded areas where they could approach unseen and escape easily. Forest paths were often narrow, making it difficult for large groups to defend themselves effectively. The forest path is muddy from recent rain. Medieval roads weren't paved or drained effectively. Rain turned dirt paths into muddy obstacles that were difficult to walk on and hard on footwear. Mud also concealed holes, roots, and stones that could cause twisted ankles or falls. Walking in mud was exhausting and slow. After 2 hours of forest walking, your group encounters another group of pilgrims traveling in the opposite direction. They're returning from Santiago de Compostela. Medieval pilgrims who successfully completed their journeys were valuable sources of information about road conditions, accommodation options, and hazards ahead. The returning pilgrims are 3 men from Germany. They started their pilgrimage 8 months ago and are finally returning home. Medieval pilgrimage was often a once-in-a-lifetime journey because of the time, expense, and risks involved. Successful pilgrims were respected in their communities and often became informal advisors for future pilgrims. The German pilgrims warn your group about conditions ahead. A bridge has collapsed 20 miles south, forcing travelers to ford a river that's currently running high from spring snowmelt. The ford crossing is dangerous and has already claimed 2 lives this season. Medieval river crossings were hazardous even under good conditions. High water made crossings potentially fatal. The water comes up to your chest, one German pilgrim explains. The current is strong enough to knock you down. We saw 2 men swept away. Their bodies were never found. Medieval river drownings were common because most people couldn't swim, and heavy clothing made swimming impossible even for people who had basic swimming skills. Brother Antoine asks about alternative routes around the collapsed bridge. Medieval travelers faced constant route changes due to bridge failures, road washouts, and other infrastructure problems. Local knowledge was essential for finding safe alternatives, but alternatives often involved significant detours or additional costs. The German pilgrims suggest a detour that adds 40 miles, but uses a ferry crossing that's safer than the ford. The ferry costs money but provides professional service by boatmen who understand local water conditions. Medieval ferry operators were skilled at river crossings but charged prices that many pilgrims found difficult to afford. Your group faces another difficult decision. The shorter route involves a dangerous river crossing that has already killed people this season. The longer route is safer but more expensive and adds several days to your journey. Medieval travel decisions often involved choosing between different types of risks. Thomas the Miller calculates the additional costs of the longer route. Extra days of travel mean more money spent on food and accommodation. The ferry crossing will cost additional money. The longer route passes through regions where food and accommodation are more expensive because they're farther from major trade routes. Medieval economics meant that remote areas charged higher prices because transportation costs were built into everything. Jean and Isabel express concern about their children waiting at home. Every additional day on pilgrimage means another day their 4 children are being cared for by Isabel's sister. Medieval childcare arrangements were informal and based on family obligations. Extended absences strained family relationships and created burdens for relatives who had their own responsibilities. My sister has 6 children of her own, Isabel explains. Adding 4 more to her household is already difficult. If we're delayed much longer, she may not be able to continue helping. Medieval households operated on tight resources and careful planning. Unexpected additions or extended obligations could destabilize entire family economics. Agnes favors the safer route despite the additional expense. Her shoe repair experience taught her that equipment problems and safety issues can become much more expensive if not addressed properly. Medieval travelers learned quickly that false economy often led to greater expenses and dangers later. Robert agrees with his wife, but worries about their dwindling money supply. Medieval financial planning for long journeys was difficult because costs were unpredictable and income opportunities were limited. Pilgrims who ran out of money faced unpleasant choices about how to continue their journeys. Your group decides to take the safer, more expensive route. Medieval group dynamics often favored caution over speed because group survival was more important than individual convenience. Dead pilgrims couldn't complete their religious obligations or return home to their families. The German pilgrims provide detailed directions for the detour route. Medieval navigation relied heavily on verbal descriptions of landmarks, road conditions, and distances. These directions were passed from traveler to traveler, becoming more detailed and accurate over time as more people used the routes. Follow the main road for 15 miles until you see a stone cross with a carved fish. the first German pilgrim explains. Turn west at the cross and follow a smaller path for 8 miles. You'll come to a village called Saint-Pierre-du-Pont. The ferry is just beyond the village. Medieval directions used religious landmarks whenever possible because churches and stone crosses were permanent features that travelers could recognize easily. Stone crosses marked important road junctions, indicated directions to religious sites, and served as navigation aids for illiterate travelers who couldn't read written directions. The second German pilgrim adds warnings about the path to Saint-Pierre-du-Pont. The path is narrow and passes through dense forest. Stay on the main path and don't follow any side trails. There are abandoned villages in the woods where plague killed everyone 20 years ago. The buildings are still standing, but they're dangerous. Medieval abandoned villages were common results of plague outbreaks, warfare, or economic collapse. These ghost villages were considered dangerous places where diseases might linger and evil spirits might dwell. Medieval people avoided abandoned settlements unless absolutely necessary for shelter during emergencies. The third German pilgrim warns about wolves in the forest between the main road and Saint-Pierre-du-Pont. We saw wolf tracks near the path. Fresh tracks. Big wolves. Travel during daylight hours only, and make noise as you walk. Wolves avoid humans who seem confident and dangerous. Medieval wolf populations were much larger than modern wolf populations. Wolves were a genuine threat to travelers, especially during winter months when their normal prey was scarce. Medieval people developed various strategies for wolf avoidance, including traveling in groups, carrying weapons, and making noise to announce their presence. Your group thanks the German pilgrims for their advice and warnings. Medieval information sharing between travelers was essential for safe passage. Pilgrims who hoarded information or gave false directions were considered dangerous to the pilgrim community and were often shunned by other travelers. The German pilgrims continue their journey toward home. You watch them disappear around a bend in the forest path. Medieval partings between travelers were often final. The likelihood of encountering the same people again was small unless you were traveling the same route at the same speed for extended periods. Your group continues walking through the forest. The afternoon sun filters through the thick canopy, creating patches of light and shadow on the muddy path. Medieval forests were quieter than modern forests because there were fewer birds and small animals. Hunting pressure and habitat changes had reduced wildlife populations in many areas. Brother Antoine leads the group in reciting prayers as you walk. Medieval pilgrims often prayed while walking, both for spiritual reasons and for practical purposes. Group prayer helped maintain walking rhythm and provided shared activity that reduced boredom during long hours of travel. The prayers Brother Antoine chooses are specifically for traveler protection. Medieval Christianity had prayers for every situation and activity. Travel prayers asked for protection from bandits, wild animals, accidents, illness, and getting lost. The prayers were recited in Latin, then repeated in French for group members who didn't understand Latin. Agnes asks Brother Antoine about the meaning of the Latin prayers. Medieval religious education for laypeople was limited, and many Christians participated in religious services without understanding the language being used. Translation and explanation of prayers was an important service that educated pilgrims could provide for their traveling companions. We ask St. Christopher to protect us during our journey, Brother Antoine explains. St. Christopher is the patron saint of travelers. We also ask St. James to guide us safely to his shrine in Santiago. Medieval saints had specific areas of responsibility and expertise. Travelers invoked multiple saints to ensure comprehensive divine protection. Thomas the Miller asks why prayers are recited in Latin when most people speak French. Medieval religious practices preserved Latin as the sacred language even though it was no longer spoken in daily life. Church authorities believed that Latin prayers were more effective because Latin was the language of religious scholarship and biblical translation. Brother Antoine explains that Latin connects modern Christians to the early church and to Christians throughout Europe who use the same prayers. Medieval Christianity emphasized unity and universality. Using Latin prayers meant that pilgrims from different countries could pray together, even if they spoke different native languages. Your group reaches the stone cross with the carved fish after walking for 4 hours. Medieval distance estimates were often inaccurate because they were based on walking time rather than precise measurements. 15 miles could mean anything from 12 to 18 actual miles depending on terrain, weather, and walking speed. The stone cross is larger than expected. It stands 12 feet tall and is carved from a single piece of granite. Medieval stone carving was skilled craftsmanship that required years of training and experience. The fish carving is detailed and clearly visible despite years of weather exposure. This cross was obviously expensive and built to last centuries. At the base of the cross, someone has left small offerings: wildflowers, coins, pieces of bread, and carved wooden tokens. Medieval travelers often left offerings at roadside shrines and crosses as prayers for safe passage or thanks for protection already received. These offerings were considered sacred and were rarely disturbed by other travelers. Your group pauses at the cross for prayers and rest. Medieval pilgrims used roadside shrines as natural stopping points for spiritual observances and physical recuperation. The pause also allows everyone to drink water, eat small amounts of food, and check their equipment for problems. The path west from the stone cross is narrower and less well maintained than the main road. Medieval secondary roads received less traffic and less maintenance attention. Tree branches hang low over the path, and roots create obstacles that could trip unwary walkers. The path shows evidence of recent use but is clearly not a major route. Your group walks single file due to the narrow path width. Medieval forest paths were often only wide enough for one person at a time. This formation made conversation difficult and group coordination more challenging. Single file walking also made the group more vulnerable to ambush because people couldn't see what was happening ahead or behind them. Brother Antoine continues leading prayers, but his voice is quieter now due to wolf warnings from the German pilgrims. Medieval travelers balanced competing needs for spiritual observance and physical safety. Loud prayers provided spiritual comfort, but might attract unwanted attention from predators or bandits. The forest here is older and darker than the previous forest. These trees are massive oaks and beeches that have been growing for centuries. Medieval old-growth forests were dense, dark, and intimidating. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, creating a twilight atmosphere even during midday hours. Strange sounds come from the deep forest on both sides of the path. Rustling branches, distant animal calls, and occasional sounds that might be falling timber or might be something else entirely. Medieval forests contained many sounds that travelers couldn't identify. Unknown sounds created anxiety because they might indicate approaching danger. Agnes walks close behind Robert, holding onto his belt for reassurance. Medieval women were taught to be wary of forests because forests were associated with danger, lawlessness, and evil influences. Women traveling through forests stayed close to male companions, who were expected to provide protection if needed. Thomas the Miller carries his walking stick like a weapon. Medieval walking sticks were designed to serve multiple purposes, including self-defense. A good walking stick could be used as a club against human attackers or as a spear against wild animals. Most pilgrims had some basic weapons training from their village militia service. Your group encounters wolf tracks in a muddy section of the path. The tracks are large and fresh, probably made within the last few hours. Medieval wolf tracks were easy to identify because wolves were larger than most domestic dogs. Fresh tracks indicated that wolves were active in the immediate area and might be following or observing your group. Jean examines the tracks carefully. Medieval peasants developed tracking skills for hunting and for avoiding dangerous animals. Jean's examination reveals that the tracks were made by at least 3 wolves, possibly more. Multiple wolves indicated a pack, which was more dangerous than a single wolf. "These are big wolves," Jean announces. "The largest tracks are bigger than my fist. These wolves are well-fed and confident." Medieval wolves that were well-fed and confident were more likely to approach humans than hungry, desperate wolves. Well-fed wolves weren't afraid of humans and might see travelers as potential prey rather than threats to avoid. Your group increases walking speed and tightens formation. Medieval anti-wolf tactics included staying close together, making noise, and avoiding behavior that might trigger predatory responses. Running away from wolves was generally considered a bad strategy because it activated their chase instincts. Brother Antoine begins singing hymns instead of reciting prayers. Medieval singing served multiple purposes during forest travel. Singing announced human presence to wildlife, provided rhythm for group walking, and boosted morale during stressful situations. Hymns also provided spiritual comfort when facing potential danger. The singing works as intended. You don't see any wolves, but you hear them howling in the distance. Medieval wolf howling was communication between pack members about location, prey, and territorial boundaries. Distant howling was preferable to close howling, but it confirmed that wolves were aware of your group's presence. After 3 hours of forest walking, your group emerges into farmland surrounding the village of Saint-Pierre-du-Pont. Medieval villages were usually surrounded by fields and pastures that provided buffer zones between settlements and dangerous wilderness areas. The sight of cultivated fields and grazing animals indicated safety and civilization. The village is larger than expected, with perhaps 200 residents. Medieval villages of this size usually had specialized craftsmen, a proper church, and facilities for travelers. Larger villages were more likely to have inns, taverns, and shops where pilgrims could purchase supplies or services. Smoke rises from chimneys throughout the village. Medieval villages were active from dawn to dusk, with cooking fires, craft workshops, and other activities producing constant smoke. The smoke indicated normal village life and suggested that the community was prosperous enough to afford fuel for fires throughout the day. Your group approaches the village carefully. Medieval travelers were always cautious when approaching unfamiliar settlements because village reception could range from friendly hospitality to hostile suspicion. Pilgrims were generally welcome, but some villages had negative experiences with travelers who caused problems. The first person you encounter is a farmer leading 2 oxen back from the fields. Medieval farmers worked from sunrise to sunset during growing seasons. Evening was the time for bringing livestock back to village enclosures, where they would be safer from wolves and thieves during the night. The farmer greets your group politely and asks about your destination. Medieval social customs required polite interaction with travelers, but farmers also gathered information about road conditions, news from other areas, and potential problems that might affect their village. "We're pilgrims traveling to Santiago de Compostela," Brother Antoine explains. "We seek the ferry crossing and accommodation for the night." Medieval pilgrim identification was important for receiving proper treatment from local communities. Genuine pilgrims could expect hospitality, while suspicious travelers might be turned away or reported to authorities. The farmer provides directions to the ferry and recommends the village inn for accommodation. Medieval farmers often knew about local services because they interacted with travelers regularly and heard reports about service quality from previous visitors. Farmer recommendations were generally reliable because farmers had no financial interest in misleading travelers. "The ferry operates until sunset," the farmer explains. "After sunset, you'll have to wait until dawn for the next crossing. The ferryman charges 3 copper pennies per person for pilgrims. Regular travelers pay 6 copper pennies. Medieval ferry operations were limited by daylight hours because river crossings were dangerous in darkness. Reduced rates for pilgrims were common because pilgrimage was considered religiously beneficial. Your group decides to attempt the ferry crossing before sunset rather than staying overnight in the village. Medieval travel decisions often involved weighing the costs of accommodation against the risks of delayed departure. Every night spent in inns meant money spent on rooms and meals that could be saved by sleeping outdoors. The ferry landing is a quarter-mile beyond the village on the riverbank. Medieval ferries operated from established landing sites that provided safe access to the water and storage for ferry equipment. Ferry landings often had small buildings for passengers to wait during bad weather or ferry delays. The river is wider and faster than expected. The water is brown with spring runoff and debris from upstream areas. Medieval rivers carried much more sediment and debris than modern rivers because erosion control and watershed management didn't exist. Spring runoff was particularly dangerous because snowmelt created high water and strong currents. The ferry is a large wooden platform guided by ropes stretched across the river. Medieval ferry design was simple but effective. The rope system allowed ferrymen to control the ferry's movement across the current without requiring rowing or paddling. This design worked well for regular crossings, but was vulnerable to rope failure or severe weather. The ferryman is a large, muscular man named Pierre. Medieval ferry operators needed physical strength to handle heavy ferry equipment and to assist passengers during difficult crossings. Pierre has been operating this ferry for 15 years and knows the river conditions better than anyone else in the region. The water is running higher than usual, Pierre explains. Spring snowmelt started early this year, and the mountains got more snow than normal. I can get you across safely, but you'll get wet. The ferry rides lower in the water when it's loaded with passengers. Medieval river crossings involved getting wet under the best conditions. Ferry platforms didn't have sides or railings that would prevent water from splashing onto passengers. High water made crossings wetter and more dangerous, but experienced ferrymen could usually manage safe crossings unless conditions were extreme. Your group pays the ferry fee and boards the wooden platform. Medieval ferry loading required careful weight distribution to maintain platform stability. Passengers stood in designated areas and held onto rope railings while the ferryman controlled the crossing. Movement during crossing was discouraged because it could destabilize the platform. The ferry crossing takes 20 minutes. Medieval river crossings were slow because ferrymen prioritized safety over speed. Rushing a ferry crossing in high water could result in the ferry being swept downstream or capsized by strong currents. Pierre uses the rope system skillfully to maintain control despite the swift current. Halfway across the river, a large tree branch floating downstream collides with the ferry platform. Medieval rivers carried substantial debris during high water periods. Floating logs, branches, and other debris could damage ferry equipment or knock passengers overboard. Pierre uses a long pole to push the branch away from the ferry. Agnes screams when the branch hits the platform. The collision makes the ferry rock violently, and water splashes onto the platform. Medieval ferry accidents were common enough that even minor incidents caused panic among passengers who understood how dangerous river crossings could be. "Stay calm and hold the ropes," Pierre shouts. Medieval ferry operators were experienced at managing passenger panic during difficult crossings. Panic could cause passengers to move suddenly or jump overboard, creating additional dangers for everyone on the ferry. The ferry reaches the far shore safely. Everyone is wet but unharmed. Medieval travelers expected to get wet during river crossings and dressed accordingly. Wool clothing retained some insulating properties even when wet, which was important for preventing hypothermia after water exposure. Pierre helps each passenger step off the ferry platform onto the muddy riverbank. Medieval ferry landings were often muddy due to constant water exposure and traffic from passengers and animals. Safe disembarkation required assistance because wet platforms and muddy banks were slippery and dangerous. Your group thanks Pierre for the safe crossing and continues walking toward the next village. Medieval travelers always thanked ferry operators who provided safe passage because ferry crossings were dangerous and skilled ferrymen saved lives regularly. Tips weren't customary, but thanks and blessings were considered appropriate appreciation. The road on the far side of the river is in better condition than the forest paths. This road carries more traffic and receives more maintenance attention because it connects several villages and serves as a trade route for goods moving between regions. Medieval major roads were still primitive by modern standards, but were much better than secondary paths. Your group's clothes begin drying as you walk in the late afternoon sun. Medieval wool clothing dried slowly but provided insulation even when damp. Cotton clothing would have been dangerous when wet because cotton loses all insulating properties when soaked with water. Wool was the preferred fabric for travelers who expected to get wet during their journeys. You encounter other travelers on this road. A merchant with 2 pack mules carrying trade goods. A family moving from one village to another with their possessions loaded on a cart. A priest traveling between parishes. Medieval roads carried diverse traffic, including commercial, religious, and personal travelers with various destinations and purposes. The merchant traveling with pack mules warns your group about bandits operating between here and the next major town. Medieval merchants were valuable sources of information about road conditions because they traveled regularly and carried goods that bandits wanted to steal. Merchant warnings about bandit activity were taken seriously by other travelers. 3 merchants were robbed 2 days ago, the merchant explains. The bandits took everything, including the pack animals. The merchants arrived in town naked and bleeding. The bandits are getting bolder and more violent. Medieval bandit activity fluctuated based on economic conditions, law enforcement effectiveness, and seasonal factors. Brother Antoine asks about the location of the bandit attacks. Medieval bandits often operated from specific locations that provided advantages for ambush and escape. Travelers who knew where attacks had occurred could take precautions or choose alternative routes to avoid dangerous areas. The merchant describes a section of road that passes through a narrow valley with dense forest on both sides. Medieval bandits preferred locations where they could approach unseen and where victims couldn't escape easily. Valleys with limited visibility and escape routes were ideal bandit territory. The attacks happen in late afternoon when travelers are tired and less alert. The merchant continues. The bandits wait until victims are in the deepest part of the valley where help can't arrive quickly. Medieval bandit tactics were sophisticated and based on careful observation of traveler patterns. Weaknesses. Your group faces another difficult decision about route and timing. The dangerous valley can be avoided by taking a longer route that adds 15 miles to your journey. Alternatively, you could travel through the valley early in the morning when bandits are less likely to be active. Medieval travel planning required constant risk assessment and route modification. Thomas the Miller suggests camping tonight and traveling through the valley at dawn. Medieval bandits rarely operated during early morning hours because they needed darkness for concealment and escape. Dawn travel also provided maximum daylight hours for dealing with any problems that might arise during passage through dangerous areas. Jean and Isabel prefer the longer, safer route despite the additional walking distance. Medieval parents traveling away from their children were especially risk-averse because their death would leave their children orphaned. The extra walking was less concerning than the possibility of being killed by bandits. Robert and Agnes agree with taking the longer route. Their recent experience with equipment problems and unexpected expenses has made them cautious about taking unnecessary risks. Medieval travelers learned quickly that small problems could cascade into major disasters if they occurred in dangerous situations. Brother Antoine suggests seeking divine guidance through prayer before making the final decision. Medieval Christians consulted God through prayer before making important decisions, especially decisions involving physical danger or moral choices. Group prayer also helped ensure that everyone agreed with whatever decision was reached. Your group stops by the roadside for prayer and discussion. Medieval group decision-making was slow and involved extensive consultation because everyone's life depended on reaching consensus about dangerous choices. Hasty decisions could result in group members being killed or the group being split apart by disagreement. The prayer session lasts 30 minutes and includes requests for divine guidance, protection from danger, and wisdom in choosing the safest route. Medieval prayers were often lengthy and detailed because Christians believed that thorough prayer was more likely to receive divine attention and assistance. After prayer and discussion, your group decides to take the longer, safer route. Medieval pilgrims generally chose caution over speed when facing significant dangers. Completing the pilgrimage alive was more important than completing it quickly, and dead pilgrims couldn't fulfill their religious obligations. The longer route leads through agricultural areas with scattered farmsteads and small villages. Medieval farming communities provided safer travel environments because they had established populations who could provide assistance if travelers encountered problems. Bandits also avoided areas with active farming because farmers often reported suspicious activity to authorities. Evening approaches as your group walks through farmland. Medieval travelers preferred to reach accommodation before complete darkness because nighttime travel was dangerous due to poor visibility, increased wildlife activity, and higher likelihood of getting lost or injured. You encounter a farming family returning from their fields with agricultural tools and a cart loaded with harvested vegetables. Medieval farming families worked together on all agricultural activities because farming required more labor than individual families could provide. Children participated in farm work from early ages because their labor was essential for family survival. The farming family consists of a man, woman, and 3 children ranging in age from 8 to 15. Medieval farming families often had multiple children because child mortality was high and agricultural work required substantial labor. Children who survived to adulthood were expected to care for aging parents who could no longer work effectively. The farmer greets your group politely and asks about your travel plans. Medieval social customs required interaction with travelers, but farmers also gathered information about road conditions, weather reports, and potential problems that might affect their community. Pilgrims were generally welcome sources of news from distant areas. Brother Antoine explains that your group seeks accommodation for the night and asks about available options. Medieval accommodation for travelers was limited and often required advance arrangements or recommendations from local residents. Farmers often knew about local hospitality options because they interacted regularly with travelers. The farmer recommends a monastery 3 miles ahead that provides pilgrim accommodation. Medieval monasteries were required by religious law to provide hospitality for travelers, especially pilgrims undertaking religious journeys. Monastery accommodation was usually free but basic, consisting of shared sleeping areas and simple meals. The monks at Saint-Benoît provide good meals and clean beds, the farmer explains. They ask for donations but don't require payment. The monastery is well maintained and safe. Medieval monastery recommendations from local residents were reliable because farmers had no incentive to mislead travelers about accommodation quality. The farmer's wife adds warnings about the road between here and the monastery. The path crosses a stream that floods during spring runoff. If the water is too high to cross safely, there's a shepherd's hut on this side of the stream where travelers can wait until morning. Medieval backup plans were essential because weather and seasonal conditions could make roads impassable without warning. Your group thanks the farming family for their advice and continues walking toward the monastery. Medieval farmers were generous with information and advice for travelers because they understood the difficulties and dangers of medieval travel. Helping travelers was also considered a Christian duty that earned spiritual merit. The sun sets as you walk towards Saint-Benoît Monastery. Medieval sunset marked the end of safe travel time because darkness brought increased dangers from wildlife, bandits, and accidents caused by poor visibility. Reaching accommodation before complete darkness was essential for safe travel. The monastery bells ring for evening prayers as your group approaches the monastery gates. Medieval monasteries followed strict daily schedules that included multiple prayer sessions throughout each day. Evening prayers marked the transition from daytime activities to nighttime rest and reflection. Saint-Benoît Monastery is surrounded by stone walls with a large wooden gate that stands open during daylight hours. Medieval monasteries required defensive walls because they contained valuable items, including food stores, religious artifacts, and sometimes treasure donated by wealthy patrons. Monastery walls also provided protection for travelers who sought sanctuary. A monk greets your group at the monastery gate. Medieval monastery hospitality was managed by specific monks who were responsible for receiving travelers and managing guest accommodations. These monks were chosen for their social skills and ability to assess whether travelers were genuine pilgrims or potential troublemakers. Brother Dom Francis introduces himself as the guest master. Medieval monasteries had specific roles for different monks, and guest master was an important position that required good judgment about human nature and potential problems. Dom Francis has been serving as guest master for 12 years and has experience with thousands of pilgrims. Welcome, pilgrims, Dom Francis says. We provide accommodation, meals, and spiritual services for travelers undertaking religious journeys. We ask for donations according to your ability to pay, but no one is turned away for lack of money. Medieval monastery hospitality balanced religious obligation with practical financial needs. Your group follows Dom Francis into the monastery courtyard. Medieval monastery architecture was designed around courtyards that provided central gathering spaces and access to various monastery buildings. The courtyard also served as a safe area where travelers could rest and socialize with other pilgrims. The monastery courtyard contains a well, several outbuildings, and gardens where monks grow vegetables and herbs. Medieval monasteries were self-sufficient communities that produced their own food, manufactured their own tools, and maintained their own buildings. Monastery gardens provided fresh food for residents and guests. Dom Francis shows your group to the pilgrim dormitory. Medieval monastery accommodation for travelers consisted of large rooms with multiple beds or sleeping areas. Privacy wasn't available, but the accommodation was usually clean, safe, and warmer than sleeping outdoors. Pilgrims shared dormitory space with other travelers. The pilgrim dormitory contains 20 beds and is currently occupied by 15 other pilgrims from various countries. Medieval pilgrimage routes attracted travelers from throughout Europe who were undertaking religious journeys for various reasons. The dormitory provides opportunities for pilgrims to share information and experiences. Your group meets pilgrims from England, Germany, Italy, and France. Medieval pilgrimage was an international activity that brought together people from different countries, social classes, and backgrounds. Pilgrim dormitories were melting pots where travelers learned about different cultures and customs. An English pilgrim named William shares information about road conditions ahead. Medieval information sharing between pilgrims was essential for safe travel because road conditions, bandit activity, and accommodation options changed frequently. Experienced pilgrims provided valuable advice for newer travelers. The road to Santiago passes through mountains that are still covered with snow, William explains. Mountain passes won't be safe for another month. You'll need to take the longer route through the valleys. Medieval mountain travel was seasonal because snow and ice made high-altitude passes impassable during winter and early spring. A German pilgrim named Heinrich warns about a plague outbreak in a town 50 miles ahead. Medieval plague outbreaks were common and deadly. Travelers who entered infected areas faced high risk of contracting diseases that had mortality rates of 50% or higher. Avoiding plague areas was essential for survival. The town has been quarantined for 2 weeks, Heinrich explains. No one is allowed to enter or leave. Travelers are being turned away at sword point. You'll need to detour around the entire region. Medieval quarantine enforcement was brutal but necessary because plague spread rapidly through populations that had no understanding of disease transmission. An Italian pilgrim named Marco shares positive news about a new bridge that has been completed over a river that previously required dangerous ford crossings. Medieval infrastructure improvements were rare and valuable because they reduced travel dangers and delays. New bridges often changed preferred pilgrimage routes. The bridge is beautiful and safe, Marco explains. The crossing fee is reasonable, and the bridge eliminates 2 days of detour that was previously necessary to reach a safe ford. Medieval bridge construction was expensive and time-consuming, so new bridges were significant improvements that benefited all travelers. Your group listens carefully to all information shared by other pilgrims. Medieval travel planning required constant updates and route modifications based on current conditions. Information from experienced travelers was more valuable than maps or written guides because conditions changed faster than written materials could be updated. Dom Francis rings a bell to announce the evening meal. Medieval monastery meals were served at specific times according to religious schedules. Pilgrims were expected to follow monastery rules about meal times, prayer participation, and behavior while staying in monastery accommodations. The evening meal is served in the monastery refectory. Medieval monastery dining halls were large rooms where residents and guests ate together in silence or while listening to religious readings. Communal meals were important for monastery community life and provided opportunities for social interaction among pilgrims. The meal consists of bread, vegetable soup, cheese, and watered wine. Medieval monastery food was simple but nutritious and filling. Monasteries often provided better meals than pilgrims could afford in commercial inns because monasteries produced their own food and could offer generous portions without losing money. Dom Francis reads from the Bible during the meal. Medieval monastery meals included religious readings that provided spiritual nourishment along with physical food. The readings were usually selected to be appropriate for travelers and often included stories about biblical journeys and divine protection for faithful people. After the meal, pilgrims gather in the courtyard for evening prayers and informal conversation. Medieval monastery evenings provided opportunities for rest, reflection, and social interaction among travelers who shared common goals and experiences. Evening conversations often included storytelling and information sharing. Brother Antoine leads evening prayers for your group and other French-speaking pilgrims. Medieval pilgrims often organized prayer groups based on shared languages because prayer was more meaningful when participants understood the words being spoken. Latin prayers were universal, but vernacular prayers created stronger emotional connections. William the English pilgrim shares stories about his journey from Canterbury to Santiago. Medieval pilgrims often undertook multiple religious journeys during their lifetimes, visiting different shrines and holy sites throughout Europe. Experienced pilgrims were sources of inspiration and practical advice for newer travelers. "I've been walking for 6 months," William explains. "I started at Canterbury, crossed the Channel, and have been following pilgrimage routes through France. This is my 3rd pilgrimage to Santiago. Each journey teaches me something new about faith and endurance." Medieval long-distance pilgrimage required extraordinary physical and mental endurance. Heinrich, the German pilgrim, explains that he's fulfilling a vow made during a serious illness. Medieval people often made pilgrimage vows during crises, promising to undertake religious journeys if they survived illnesses, accidents, or other life-threatening situations. Fulfilling these vows was considered essential for maintaining divine favor. "I nearly died from fever last year," Heinrich explains. "I promised St. James that if I recovered, I would walk to his shrine in Santiago. The fever broke 3 days after I made the vow. I believe St. James saved my life, so I must honor my promise." Medieval votive pilgrimage was common and deeply personal. Marco, the Italian pilgrim, is traveling to Santiago to seek divine intervention for his infertile wife. Medieval people believed that pilgrimage could solve various personal problems, including medical conditions, family troubles, and financial difficulties. Pilgrimage was considered a powerful form of prayer that demonstrated serious commitment to religious faith. "My wife and I have been married for 8 years without children," Marco explains. "We've tried every remedy suggested by physicians and wise women. Pilgrimage to Santiago is our last hope for divine blessing." Medieval fertility problems were common and had no effective medical treatments, making religious solutions seem reasonable. Your group shares your own pilgrimage motivations with the other travelers. Medieval pilgrim communities developed quickly because shared hardships and common goals created bonds between strangers. Telling personal stories helped pilgrims understand each other and provided emotional support during difficult journeys. Thomas the Miller explains his guilt about profiteering during famine. Medieval commerce was governed by Christian principles that forbade taking advantage of desperate people, but practical necessity often conflicted with religious ideals. Pilgrimage provided a way to seek forgiveness for moral compromises. Jean and Isabel describe their fears about future childbirth dangers. Medieval childbirth mortality was extremely high, and women who survived multiple births often sought religious protection for future pregnancies. Pilgrimage was believed to provide special divine favor for women facing childbirth. Robert and Agnes explain their fertility concerns and hope that Santiago pilgrimage will provide the divine blessing they need to conceive children. Medieval couples without children faced social pressure and economic concerns because children provided labor and old age support that childless couples couldn't access. You describe your gratitude for your son's recovery from fever and your desire to fulfill your vow to St. James. Medieval votive promises were considered sacred obligations that had to be fulfilled regardless of inconvenience or expense. Breaking vows was believed to invite divine punishment. Brother Antoine shares his promise to his dying wife and his continuing grief over her death. Medieval widowhood was difficult for both men and women because medieval society was organized around married couples. Widowed people often undertook pilgrimage, seeking spiritual comfort and new purpose in life. The evening conversation continues until the monastery bells ring for night prayers. Medieval monasteries maintained strict schedules that included evening prayer services before bedtime. Pilgrims were welcome to participate in monastery prayers, but weren't required to attend if they preferred rest. Your group participates in the night prayer service in the monastery chapel. Medieval monastery chapels were designed for acoustic clarity and spiritual atmosphere. Candlelight, incense, and chanted prayers created an environment that enhanced religious experience and provided comfort for worried travelers. The night prayer service includes prayers for traveler protection and successful completion of religious journeys. Medieval monastic prayers often included specific requests for pilgrim safety because monks understood the dangers and difficulties that pilgrims faced during their journeys. Monastery prayers provided spiritual support for pilgrim communities. After prayers, pilgrims returned to the dormitory for sleep. Medieval sleeping arrangements in pilgrim accommodations were communal and basic. Beds consisted of straw mattresses with rough blankets. Privacy wasn't available, but the accommodation was safer and more comfortable than sleeping outdoors. You lie in your monastery bed listening to the sounds of other pilgrims settling down for sleep. Medieval dormitory life included various sounds from people with different sleeping habits, health problems, and cultural backgrounds. Learning to sleep in communal accommodations was part of the pilgrimage experience. Some pilgrims snore loudly, others talk in their sleep. One English pilgrim coughs frequently, suggesting respiratory problems that were common in medieval populations due to poor air quality and limited medical care. Medieval sleeping accommodations weren't quiet or private, but they provided safety and basic comfort. Through the dormitory windows, you can hear monastery bells marking the hours throughout the night. Medieval monasteries maintained prayer schedules that included multiple services during nighttime hours. The bell sounds provided time references for anyone who was awake, but most pilgrims learned to sleep through the regular bell schedule. You fall asleep thinking about the journey ahead and the challenges that tomorrow will bring. Medieval pilgrims learned to focus on immediate goals rather than the full scope of their journeys because thinking about months of walking and hardship could be overwhelming. Taking each day as it came was essential for mental survival. Dawn arrives with monastery bells calling monks to morning prayers. Medieval monastery days began before sunrise with prayer services that marked the transition from night rest to daily activities. Pilgrims weren't required to attend dawn prayers, but the bells served as wake-up calls for travelers who wanted early starts. You wake to find that several pilgrims are already preparing to leave. Medieval pilgrims often started walking before full daylight to maximize daily travel distance and to reach evening accommodations before other travelers filled available spaces. Early starts also provided more time to deal with problems that might arise during travel. The monastery provides breakfast for pilgrims who want to eat before leaving. Medieval monastery breakfast was simple but substantial enough to provide energy for walking. Breakfast usually consisted of bread, porridge, and sometimes cheese or dried fruit. Medieval monastery food was designed to provide sustained energy for physical labor and long-distance walking. Your group eats quickly and prepares to continue the pilgrimage. Medieval travel preparations included checking equipment, organizing supplies, and planning the day's route based on information gathered from other travelers. Morning preparation time was limited because daylight hours were precious for covering distance. Dom Francis provides your group with directions for the next section of road and warnings about current conditions. Medieval monastery guest masters were valuable sources of up-to-date information because they received reports from pilgrims who had recently traveled various routes. This information was more current than written guides or maps. The road ahead is good for 20 miles, but then you'll reach the plague quarantine zone, Dom Francis explains. The detour around the infected area adds 40 miles, but is absolutely necessary. No one who enters the quarantine zone survives. Medieval plague quarantines were enforced with deadly force because authorities understood that plague spread through human contact. William the English pilgrim decides to travel with your group for the next section of road. Medieval pilgrims often formed temporary traveling partnerships based on shared routes and compatible walking speeds. Larger groups provided better protection against bandits and wild animals. Heinrich, the German pilgrim, chooses to travel alone because he walks faster than most groups. Medieval pilgrims had different walking speeds based on age, physical condition, and personal preferences. Some pilgrims preferred solitary travel for spiritual reasons, while others prioritized group safety and companionship. Your expanded group of 8 pilgrims leaves the monastery after receiving blessings from Dom Francis. Medieval monastery departures included religious blessings for safe travel and successful completion of pilgrim journeys. Monastery blessings were considered powerful spiritual protection that increased chances of survival. The morning road leads through countryside that's more prosperous than previous areas. Medieval regional prosperity varied significantly based on soil quality, climate, trade routes, and political stability. Prosperous areas had better roads, more services, and safer travel conditions. Your group passes several villages where markets are beginning their daily activities. Medieval village markets operated during morning hours when farmers brought produce and craftsmen displayed their goods. Markets provided opportunities for pilgrims to purchase supplies, but prices were often higher than in rural areas. A village baker offers fresh bread to your group. Medieval bakers worked during early morning hours to provide fresh bread for daily consumption. Fresh bread was a luxury for travelers who usually carried dried bread that became increasingly hard and mouldy during long journeys. Thomas the miller examines the baker's bread with professional expertise. Medieval millers understood grain quality and bread-making techniques better than most people. Thomas's evaluation helps the group determine whether the bread is worth the asking price and whether it will keep well during travel. "This bread is made from good wheat flour," Thomas announces. "It's properly baked and should stay fresh for 3 days if we keep it dry." Medieval bread quality varied enormously based on available ingredients, baker skill, and economic conditions. Good bread was valuable for travelers who needed reliable nutrition. Your group purchases 6 loaves of fresh bread for 4 copper pennies per loaf. Medieval bread prices fluctuated based on grain harvests, local competition, and seasonal demand. The price is reasonable for good quality bread, but the expense adds to your group's growing travel costs. William the English pilgrim shares dried meat from his supplies. Medieval dried meat was prepared by cutting flesh into thin strips and drying it in smoke or sun until all moisture was removed. Properly dried meat could last for months without spoiling and provided concentrated protein for travelers. Agnes examines her repaired shoes and reports that they're holding up well. Medieval equipment monitoring was essential because early detection of problems allowed for repairs before complete failure. Shoe problems that weren't addressed quickly could leave travelers unable to continue walking. The road begins climbing into hills that provide views of the surrounding countryside. Medieval hilltop views allowed travelers to see potential dangers, identify landmarks, and assess weather conditions. Hills also provided strategic advantages if the group encountered bandits or wild animals. From the hilltop, your group can see smoke rising from the quarantined town 15 miles ahead. Medieval plague towns were often burned to prevent disease spread, but smoke could also indicate normal cooking fires or craft activities. Distant smoke didn't indicate whether the quarantine was still in effect. Brother Antoine suggests that the group should pray for the people suffering in the quarantined town. Medieval Christians believed that prayer could provide spiritual comfort for distant people and might influence divine intervention in plague outbreaks. Group prayer also reinforced shared values and group solidarity. Your group pauses for prayer that includes requests for divine protection from plague and other diseases. Medieval disease prevention relied on religious observances because medical understanding of disease transmission was limited. Prayer was considered the most effective protection against epidemic diseases. The afternoon walking becomes more difficult as the hills become steeper and the road surface deteriorates. Medieval hill roads were often poorly maintained because they received less traffic and required more expensive construction techniques. Steep grades were hard on equipment and exhausting for travelers. Your group encounters a merchant caravan traveling in the opposite direction. Medieval merchant caravans were large groups of traders with pack animals, guards, and extensive supplies. Merchant caravans provided valuable information about road conditions and were often willing to trade or sell supplies to other travelers. The caravan leader warns about increased bandit activity in the area where your group plans to travel tomorrow. Medieval bandit activity fluctuated based on economic conditions, law enforcement effectiveness, and seasonal factors. Recent increases in bandit attacks indicated that travel conditions were becoming more dangerous. The bandits are well organized and heavily armed. the caravan leader explains. "They've been attacking even large groups like ours. Yesterday they killed 3 merchants and wounded 2 guards. The survivors barely escaped with their lives." Medieval bandit violence was increasing as economic conditions worsened. William asks about alternative routes that might avoid the bandit territory. Medieval route planning required constant updates based on current security conditions. Routes that were safe last month might be deadly this month, due to changing bandit patterns or other security threats. The caravan leader suggests a detour that adds 60 miles but avoids the most dangerous areas. Medieval security detours were often substantial because bandits controlled large territories and had networks of informants who reported on traveler movements. Safe routes required major course changes. Your group faces another difficult decision about balancing time, expense, and safety. Medieval travel decisions became increasingly complex as journeys progressed because accumulated delays and expenses limited options for dealing with new problems. Every detour made subsequent decisions more constrained. Thomas the Miller calculates that the suggested detour would add 8 days to the journey and require additional money for food and accommodation. Medieval financial planning for long journeys was complicated by unpredictable expenses and route changes. Running out of money could force pilgrims to abandon their journeys. Jean and Isabel express concern about their children waiting at home. Medieval parents who undertook dangerous journeys worried constantly about their children's welfare and the possibility of leaving them orphaned. Extended delays increased anxiety about family responsibilities. Robert and Agnes are running low on money and can't afford many more detours or unexpected expenses. Medieval pilgrims who exhausted their financial resources faced difficult choices about how to continue their journeys. Some became beggars, others sought employment along the route, and many simply gave up. Brother Antoine suggests seeking divine guidance through prayer and consultation with local religious authorities. Medieval decision-making often included religious consultation because Christians believed that God provided guidance for important choices. Local priests might have additional information about security conditions. Your group decides to continue toward the next village and seek advice from the local priest before making final route decisions. Medieval local priests were often the best sources of current information about regional conditions because they maintained communication networks with priests in surrounding areas. The road descends into a valley where a village is visible in the distance. Medieval valleys often provided protection from weather and bandits, but they could also be traps if escape routes were limited. Valley locations required careful assessment of strategic advantages and disadvantages. Evening approaches as your group walks toward the village. Medieval travelers preferred to reach accommodation before darkness because nighttime travel was dangerous, and most accommodations stopped accepting new guests after sunset. Timing was critical for securing safe shelter. The village is larger than expected and appears prosperous based on the size and condition of buildings. Medieval village prosperity was usually visible in building quality, road maintenance, and general activity levels. Prosperous villages often had better services and accommodation options. Your group approaches the village church to seek advice from the local priest. Medieval churches served as information centers and safe meeting places where travelers could seek guidance and assistance. Church sanctuary was respected even by bandits and criminals. The village priest, Father Guillaume, greets your group warmly and invites you into the church for conversation. Medieval priests were required to provide assistance for travelers, especially pilgrims undertaking religious journeys. Church hospitality was considered a sacred duty that earned spiritual merit. Father Guillaume confirms the caravan leader's warnings about increased bandit activity in the region. Medieval priests often had accurate information about local security conditions because they provided last rites for attack victims and heard confessions from people involved in criminal activities. The bandits killed a family of pilgrims 3 days ago, Father Guillaume explains. The entire family, parents, 3 children, and an elderly grandmother. They took everything and left the bodies by the roadside. This is not ordinary robbery. These bandits are murderers. Medieval bandit evolution toward murder indicated desperate economic conditions or breakdown of local law enforcement. Bandits who committed murder faced death penalties if caught, so killing victims meant they had nothing left to lose. Murder-oriented bandits were much more dangerous than ordinary thieves. William asks about the effectiveness of local law enforcement against the bandit problem. Medieval law enforcement was limited and often ineffective against well-organized criminal groups. Local lords were responsible for maintaining order, but they often lacked resources or motivation to fight dangerous bandits. Father Guillaume explains that the local lord has been trying to organize bandit hunting expeditions, but the bandits are too well armed and organized for local militia forces. Medieval militia were part-time soldiers with limited training and equipment. Professional bandit groups often had superior weapons and combat experience. The bandits include former soldiers who fought in recent wars. Father Guillaume continues, they have military training and weapons. Our local militia are farmers with pitchforks and hunting bows. They can't match the bandits in direct combat. Medieval post-war conditions often created bandit problems when discharged soldiers couldn't find legitimate employment. Your group realizes that the security situation is worse than initially understood. Medieval bandit groups with military training represented serious threats that required major route changes or postponement of travel plans. Continuing through such areas would be essentially suicidal. Father Guillaume suggests that your group should wait in the village for 2 weeks until a large merchant caravan with professional guards passes through the area. Medieval group travel with merchant caravans provided security that individual pilgrims couldn't achieve alone. However, waiting meant additional expenses and delays. Thomas the miller objects to a 2-week delay because of concerns about his mill being managed properly in his absence. Medieval business owners who traveled faced constant worry about their enterprises being mismanaged or failing completely. Extended delays could result in financial ruin. Jean and Isabel are torn between wanting safety and wanting to return home to their children quickly. Medieval parents faced agonizing choices between personal safety and family responsibilities. Every day away from home increased risks to children who depended on parental care. Brother Antoine suggests that the group should split up with some members waiting for the merchant caravan and others taking alternative routes based on their individual circumstances. Medieval group travel decisions sometimes required splitting groups when members had incompatible needs or resources. Your group spends the evening in intense discussion about how to proceed. Medieval travel decisions involved life or death choices that required careful consideration of all options and consequences. Hasty decisions could result in death, but excessive delay could create other serious problems. The village inn provides accommodation that's more comfortable than monastery dormitories, but also more expensive. Medieval commercial lodging offered privacy and better meals, but cost money that pilgrims needed for other expenses. Choosing between comfort and economy was a constant dilemma. During the evening meal at the inn, your group meets other travelers who provide additional information about regional conditions. Medieval inn conversations were valuable sources of current information because inns attracted diverse travelers with knowledge about different areas and routes. A wool merchant reports that the alternative route suggested by the caravan leader is now also experiencing bandit problems. Medieval bandit activity often spread to alternative routes when original territories became too dangerous or unprofitable. Finding safe routes required constant intelligence updates. The bandits have been moving around, the wool merchant explains. They attack on the main route for a few days, then move to alternative routes when people start avoiding the main road. They seem to know where travelers are going before the travelers decide. Medieval bandit intelligence networks included informants in villages, inns, and markets who reported on traveler movements and destinations. Organized bandit groups often had advance warning about valuable targets and could position themselves for optimal attacks. A grain trader suggests that all non-essential travel should be postponed until spring, when increased trade activity would provide more group travel opportunities. Medieval seasonal travel patterns meant that winter months had less traffic and fewer opportunities for safe group travel. Your group realizes that the security situation is deteriorating rapidly and that normal pilgrimage routes may be impossible until conditions improve. Medieval political instability often made pilgrimage temporarily impossible in affected regions. Pilgrims sometimes had to wait months or years for safe travel conditions. Agnes begins crying because she realizes that completing the pilgrimage may be impossible with their limited resources. Medieval pilgrims who faced insurmountable obstacles often experienced profound disappointment because pilgrimage represented major life investments of time, money, and emotional commitment. Robert tries to comfort his wife, but is also obviously distressed by their situation. Medieval couples who undertook pilgrimages together faced shared disappointment when circumstances prevented completion of their religious journeys. Failed pilgrimages could affect family relationships and financial stability. Thomas the miller announces that he's decided to abandon the pilgrimage and return home immediately. Medieval pilgrims sometimes reached breaking points where continuing became impossible or irrational. Abandoning pilgrimage was disappointing but sometimes necessary for survival. "I can't afford to wait weeks for safe passage," Thomas explains. "My mill needs me, and I don't have enough money for extended delays. I'll have to seek forgiveness some other way." Medieval practical necessities often conflicted with religious obligations. Jean and Isabel decide to continue with the pilgrimage, but to wait for the merchant caravan despite the expense and delay. Medieval parents often chose maximum safety options when making decisions that affected their children's future welfare. The additional cost was justified by increased survival chances. Robert and Agnes decide to abandon the pilgrimage and return home with Thomas. Medieval couples with limited resources often made practical decisions that disappointed their spiritual goals but preserved their physical safety and financial stability. Brother Antoine chooses to continue alone using back roads and forest paths that might be safer than main routes. Medieval solo pilgrims sometimes chose high-risk strategies that groups couldn't attempt. Solo travel provided flexibility but eliminated group protection. William the English pilgrim decides to wait for the merchant caravan and continue to Santiago, despite the delays and expense. Medieval experienced pilgrims were often willing to accept significant hardships to complete their religious journeys, because they understood the spiritual importance of fulfilling their obligations. Your group splits up after emotional farewells and promises to pray for each other's safety. Medieval pilgrim group separations were often permanent, because different route choices meant that travelers wouldn't encounter each other again. Group bonds formed quickly but were often brief. You decide to continue with Brother Antoine using back roads despite the increased risks. Medieval route decisions required balancing known dangers against unknown alternatives. Back roads might be safer from bandits, but could present other hazards like getting lost or encountering wild animals. Thomas, Robert, Agnes, Jean, and Isabel begin the journey back toward their homes. Medieval pilgrimage abandonment was disappointing but sometimes necessary. Returning home safely was better than dying on the road, and religious forgiveness could potentially be sought through other means. You, Brother Antoine, and William begin walking toward what you hope will be a safer route to Santiago. Medieval alternative routes often required local guides or detailed knowledge of regional geography. Getting lost on unfamiliar paths could be as dangerous as encountering bandits on main roads. The back road leads through dense forest where visibility is limited and the path is barely visible. Medieval forest paths were often overgrown and difficult to follow because they received little traffic and no maintenance. Navigation required careful attention to subtle trail markers. Brother Antoine produces a compass that he bought from a sailor in a coastal town. Medieval navigation tools were rare and expensive, but they provided crucial assistance for travelers using unfamiliar routes. Compass navigation wasn't precise, but it prevented travelers from walking in circles. Your small group of 3 walk single file through the forest, with Brother Antoine leading and consulting his compass regularly. Medieval forest navigation required constant attention because paths often branched, faded, or led to dead ends. Wrong turns could add days to journeys or lead to dangerous situations. William carries a sword that he purchased after his first pilgrimage to Santiago 5 years ago. Medieval experienced pilgrims often invested in weapons after learning about the dangers of pilgrimage routes. Swords were expensive but provided better protection than walking sticks or knives. The forest is eerily quiet with few bird sounds or animal movements. Medieval forests that were too quiet often indicated the presence of large predators or human threats that had frightened away normal wildlife. Unusual forest conditions required extra caution from travelers. Your group discovers evidence of a recent campfire where someone had camped within the last few days. Medieval forest camps could indicate legitimate travelers, hermits, bandits, or hunters. Fresh camps meant that other people were active in the area, which could be either reassuring or threatening. Brother Antoine examines the campfire remains and finds evidence that suggests military activity. Medieval military camps had distinctive characteristics including organized layouts, specific fire patterns, and equipment traces that experienced travelers could identify. This camp was made by soldiers or former soldiers, Brother Antoine explains. The fire was built for concealment, not warmth. The sleeping areas are positioned for defense. These could be the bandits that everyone is talking about. Medieval bandit camps often showed military organization because many bandits were former soldiers. Your group decides to change direction and avoid the area around the bandit camp. Medieval threat avoidance required immediate route changes even when alternatives were unknown or potentially more dangerous. Confirmed bandit presence eliminated any consideration of continuing in that direction. The route change leads your group deeper into the forest where the path becomes even more difficult to follow. Medieval navigation decisions often forced travelers to choose between known dangers and unknown risks. Avoiding bandits might lead to getting lost, encountering wolves, or facing other wilderness hazards. As darkness approaches, your group faces the problem of finding safe shelter for the night. Medieval forest camping required locations that provided protection from weather, wild animals, and human threats while remaining concealed from potential enemies. Safe camping spots were difficult to find. Brother Antoine suggests camping in a small clearing that's surrounded by thick undergrowth, but has access to a stream for water. Medieval campsite selection required balancing multiple factors, including water access, defensive positions, concealment, and escape routes. Perfect campsites were rare. Your group prepares a cold camp without fire to avoid attracting attention from bandits or wild animals. Medieval cold camps were uncomfortable but safer when traveling through dangerous areas. Fire provided warmth and cooking capability, but also announced traveler locations to anyone within miles. William stands first watch while you and Brother Antoine try to sleep on the cold ground. Medieval wilderness camping required watch schedules because sleeping travelers were vulnerable to attack by bandits, wolves, or other threats. Effective watches required staying alert, despite fatigue and discomfort. The night is filled with forest sounds that could indicate approaching danger or normal wildlife activity. Medieval forest sounds were difficult to interpret correctly, and travelers often spent sleepless nights listening to noises that might or might not represent threats. Anxiety was a constant companion during wilderness travel. You're awakened during your watch shift by sounds of men talking in the distance. Medieval night voices in forests usually indicated danger because legitimate travelers rarely traveled during darkness hours. The voices could belong to bandits, poachers, or other people engaged in illegal activities. The voices seem to be moving closer to your camp location. Medieval sound interpretation in darkness was difficult but essential for survival. Approaching voices meant that your group might be discovered by people who could be friendly or hostile. Preparation for either possibility was crucial. Brother Antoine wakes William and whispers warnings about the approaching voices. Medieval group communication during potential threats required silence and coordination to avoid detection while preparing for possible conflict or escape. Poor coordination could result in group members being separated or captured. Your group gathers equipment and prepares to move deeper into the forest if the voices come closer. Medieval escape planning required quick decision-making about which supplies to carry and which to abandon. Survival was more important than preserving possessions. The voices fade away as the unknown travelers move in a different direction. Medieval threat resolution often involved simply waiting for dangers to pass rather than confronting them directly. Avoiding conflict was usually safer than fighting, especially when enemy numbers and capabilities were unknown. Your group remains awake for the rest of the night because sleep becomes impossible after the security alert. Medieval stress reactions to potential threats often prevented rest even after immediate dangers passed. travelers learned to function on limited sleep because constant alertness was necessary for survival. Dawn arrives with relief that your group survived another night without being discovered by bandits or attacked by wild animals. Medieval wilderness survival was measured in successful nights rather than completed miles because each night presented multiple opportunities for death or disaster. Brother Antoine consults his compass and leads your group toward what he believes is the correct direction for reaching the next village. Medieval forest navigation was approximate at best, because compass readings had to be combined with terrain interpretation and dead reckoning. Getting lost remained a constant possibility. Your group encounters a stream that doesn't appear on Brother Antoine's mental map of the region. Medieval geography knowledge was limited and often inaccurate because maps were rare and unreliable. Unexpected terrain features required navigation adjustments that could lead to further confusion. William suggests following the stream downstream because streams usually led to rivers, and rivers led to settlements. Medieval water navigation was more reliable than land navigation because water features were permanent and visible. Following water courses reduced the risk of getting completely lost. The stream leads through increasingly difficult terrain with steep banks and thick undergrowth. Medieval watercourses often passed through areas that were impassable for normal travel because streams carved paths through obstacles that blocked overland routes. Stream following could lead to dead ends. Your group discovers that the stream leads to a waterfall that drops into a deep gorge. Medieval waterfalls represented navigation dead ends that required backtracking or finding alternative routes. Waterfall areas were often impossible to traverse safely with medieval equipment and techniques. Brother Antoine admits that his compass navigation has led the group into unknown territory. Medieval navigation failures were common and potentially fatal because getting lost in wilderness areas meant exhausting food supplies while searching for recognizable routes or settlements. Your group faces the serious problem of being lost in dangerous territory with limited supplies and no clear route to safety. Medieval wilderness survival required finding water, food, and shelter while avoiding human and animal threats. Lost travelers often died from exposure, starvation, or predator attacks. William suggests that the group should backtrack to the last recognizable landmark and attempt different navigation strategies. Medieval lost traveler strategies often involved retracing steps to known positions before attempting new routes. However, backtracking consumed time and energy that might be needed for survival. Your group begins the difficult process of retracing yesterday's route through dense forest. Medieval backtracking was complicated because forest paths looked different when traveled in opposite directions. Landmarks that were visible when approaching from one direction might be invisible when approaching from another direction. The backtracking reveals that your group took several wrong turns during yesterday's navigation. Medieval forest travel was so difficult that even experienced travelers made frequent mistakes. Correcting navigation errors required more time and energy than original travel because error correction involved covering the same ground multiple times. After 6 hours of backtracking, your group reaches the abandoned bandit camp from yesterday. Medieval navigation landmarks often included dangerous locations because they were the most memorable features in otherwise similar forest terrain. Returning to threat areas was frightening but sometimes necessary for navigation purposes. Brother Antoine decides to risk using the bandits' original route because it's the only clearly marked path in the area. Medieval route choices sometimes required using paths created by dangerous people because alternatives were worse. Following bandit routes risked encountering the bandits but provided clear navigation. Your group follows the bandit path with extreme caution and constant readiness to hide or flee if the bandits return. Medieval dangerous route travel required balancing speed against stealth because moving quickly reduced exposure time but increased noise and visibility that could attract unwanted attention. The bandit path leads to a village that's been abandoned and partially burned. Medieval abandoned villages were common results of bandit attacks, plague outbreaks, or economic collapse. Abandoned villages could provide shelter and supplies, but might also be watched by the people who caused the abandonment. Your group searches the abandoned village carefully for signs of recent activity or remaining inhabitants. Medieval village abandonment was sometimes temporary, and residents might return periodically to retrieve belongings or check on property. empty villages weren't necessarily safe from human threats. The village church is still intact and contains religious artifacts that suggest the abandonment was recent. Medieval church preservation during village destruction often occurred because even bandits respected religious sanctuary or feared divine punishment for sacrilege. Churches provided clues about abandonment circumstances. William discovers a hidden cellar beneath one of the houses that contains preserved food supplies. Medieval food storage in hidden cellars was common practice for protecting valuable supplies from bandits, armies, or tax collectors. Hidden food could be life-saving for lost travelers. Your group debates whether taking food from the abandoned village constitutes theft or legitimate survival necessity. Medieval moral questions about abandoned property were complex, because ownership rights weren't clear when property owners disappeared or died. Survival needs often overrode property concerns. Brother Antoine argues that taking food for survival is morally acceptable as long as the group leaves payment or promises to repay when possible. Medieval Christian ethics allowed necessity theft for survival purposes but required restitution when circumstances permitted. Religious travelers were expected to maintain moral standards even during emergencies. Your group takes minimal food supplies and leaves coins as payment, even though no one is present to receive them. Medieval moral behavior, in desperate situations, required maintaining ethical standards that would be recognized as proper if circumstances were later investigated by authorities or religious officials. The abandoned village provides information about local geography because it's located at a crossroads with stone markers indicating directions to other settlements. Medieval road markers were essential navigation aids that provided distance and direction information for travelers using unfamiliar routes. One stone marker indicates that Santiago de Compostela is still 400 miles away. Medieval distance markers reminded pilgrims about the enormous scope of their journeys and helped them gauge progress toward their destinations. 400 miles represented at least 6 more weeks of walking under good conditions. Another marker warns about bandit activity in the surrounding area and advises travelers to seek armed escort before continuing. Medieval warning markers were posted by local authorities when threats became severe enough to warrant official alerts. Such warnings confirmed that your group's security concerns were justified. Your group realizes that completing the pilgrimage may be impossible given current security conditions and remaining resources. Medieval pilgrims sometimes reached points where continuing became unrealistic due to accumulated problems and remaining obstacles. Accepting failure was emotionally difficult, but sometimes necessary. William suggests that partial pilgrimage completion still has spiritual value, even if the group can't reach Santiago de Compostela. Medieval religious authorities recognized that sincere effort to complete pilgrimages had merit even when circumstances prevented full completion. Attempted pilgrimage demonstrated faith and commitment. Brother Antoine proposes that the group should seek the nearest monastery and request sanctuary, while deciding whether to continue or abandon the pilgrimage. Medieval monasteries provided refuge for travelers in distress and could offer advice about whether pilgrimage continuation was feasible under current conditions. Your group follows the road markers toward the nearest monastery, which is supposedly 15 miles away. Medieval monastery locations were usually marked on road systems because monasteries served essential functions for medieval travelers, including hospitality, medical care, and spiritual guidance. The road to the monastery passes through safer territory, with more traffic and better maintenance. Medieval roads near religious institutions were usually safer, because monasteries employed guards and maintained communication with secular authorities about security threats. Religious establishments also commanded respect from most potential troublemakers. Your group encounters other travelers on the monastery road, including merchants, pilgrims, and local residents. Medieval traffic on monastery roads provided safety through numbers and indicated that the route was considered secure by people familiar with local conditions. Traffic also provided opportunities for information gathering. A merchant caravan traveling toward the monastery confirms that the security situation has improved near religious establishments, but remains dangerous in remote areas. Medieval security variations meant that travel conditions could change dramatically over short distances depending on local law enforcement and bandit activity patterns. The monastery of Saint-Martin appears in the distance as the sun begins setting. Medieval monasteries were usually visible from considerable distances because they were built on elevated sites and featured tall towers or spires. Monastery visibility provided reassurance for tired travelers who needed safe accommodation. Your group reaches the monastery gates as evening prayers begin. Medieval monastery arrival timing often coincided with religious services because monasteries followed predictable daily schedules that travelers could plan around. Arriving during prayer times was considered appropriate and respectful. Brother Dom Thomas greets your group at the monastery entrance and listens to your account of the difficulties encountered during forest travel. Medieval monastery guest masters were experienced with traveler problems and could provide advice about route options and security conditions. Dom Thomas confirms that bandit activity has made normal pilgrimage routes too dangerous for small groups without professional guards. Medieval monastery authorities maintained current information about regional security because they were responsible for advising travelers about safe passage options. Many pilgrims have abandoned their journeys this season, Dom Thomas explains. The bandits have become too organized and violent for ordinary travelers to risk passage. Even some merchant caravans have been attacked successfully. Medieval seasonal variations in travel safety sometimes made pilgrimage temporarily impossible. Your group faces the final decision about whether to continue the pilgrimage despite enormous risks, or to abandon the journey and return home safely. Medieval pilgrimage decisions involved life or death choices that required careful consideration of spiritual obligations versus practical survival needs. Brother Antoine decides to remain at the monastery and work as a laborer until security conditions improve enough to continue safely. Medieval monasteries often provided employment for stranded travelers who needed to earn money or wait for better travel conditions. Monastery work was considered spiritually beneficial. William chooses to join a merchant caravan that will provide armed escort for the remainder of his journey to Santiago. Medieval commercial escort services were expensive, but provided security that individual pilgrims couldn't achieve alone. Experienced pilgrims often used commercial services for dangerous route sections. You decide to abandon the pilgrimage and return home to your family. Medieval practical decisions often required abandoning spiritual goals when survival became uncertain. Returning home alive was better than dying on pilgrimage routes and leaving your family without support. The monastery provides accommodation for one final night before your group separates permanently. Medieval pilgrim group separations were often emotional because shared hardships created strong bonds between travelers who had faced dangers together. Final partings included promises to pray for each other's safety. During the evening meal, your group reflects on the experiences shared during the attempted pilgrimage. Medieval travel provided intense experiences that were unlike normal village life. Even failed pilgrimages taught valuable lessons about human nature, divine providence, and the importance of family responsibilities. Brother Antoine expresses gratitude for the friendship and mutual support that sustained the group through difficult situations. Medieval group travel created relationships that were deeper than normal social connections because group members depended on each other for survival in dangerous circumstances. William shares advice about pilgrimage planning for anyone who might attempt the journey in the future. Medieval experienced travelers were sources of practical knowledge that could help future pilgrims avoid problems and make better decisions about routes, equipment, and timing. You realize that attempting the pilgrimage taught you important lessons about faith, courage, and the value of family life. Medieval travel experiences often provided personal insights that were as valuable as religious benefits. Failed pilgrimages could still result in spiritual growth and personal development. The final evening includes prayers for safe travel home and gratitude for survival despite the dangers encountered. Medieval travelers who survived difficult journeys considered themselves blessed by divine protection. Survival itself was seen as evidence of God's favor and care. Morning arrives with farewells and blessings for each group member's chosen path. Medieval partings included religious blessings because travelers faced continued dangers during their separate journeys. Blessing provided spiritual protection and maintained connections between separated friends. You begin the long journey home with mixed feelings about the abandoned pilgrimage. Medieval failed enterprises created complex emotions because they represented lost investments of time, money, and effort. However, survival and return to family provided compensation for disappointed religious goals. The journey home follows safer routes through more populated areas where bandit activity is less common. Medieval return journeys often used different routes than outbound travel because travelers had learned about security conditions and could make better route choices based on experience. During the walk home, you reflect on the medieval world's harsh realities that make survival a daily challenge. Medieval life required constant vigilance against threats that modern people can't imagine. Disease, violence, accidents, and natural disasters created living conditions that were both dangerous and unpredictable. You also think about the courage required for medieval people to undertake long-distance travel despite enormous risks. Medieval pilgrims demonstrated extraordinary faith and determination by attempting religious journeys that could easily result in death. Their willingness to risk everything for spiritual goals reflected deep religious commitment. The experience taught you to appreciate the safety and stability of village life that you previously took for granted. Medieval travel experiences made people grateful for ordinary comforts like secure shelter, reliable food supplies, and familiar surroundings. Home became more precious after experiencing wilderness dangers. You realized that medieval pilgrimage was as much about the journey as the destination. Medieval religious authorities understood that pilgrimage hardships provided spiritual benefits regardless of whether pilgrims reached their intended destinations. Attempted pilgrimage demonstrated faith and commitment that had religious value. The road home passes through villages where normal life continues despite the dangers that made pilgrimage impossible. Medieval communities maintained routines and traditions even when surrounding conditions were threatening. Daily life required continuing regardless of broader security problems. You encounter other travelers who share stories about current conditions throughout the region. Medieval information networks operated through casual encounters between travelers who exchanged news about their experiences. These informal communications provided the only current information available about distant events. Some travelers report that security conditions are improving in areas where local lords have organized effective anti-bandit campaigns. Medieval law enforcement was sporadic, but could be effective when authorities committed sufficient resources to addressing specific threats. Improved security meant that future pilgrimage might become possible again. Other travelers warn about new threats including foreign armies, plague outbreaks, and natural disasters that affect different regions. Medieval threats were constantly changing and required continuous monitoring for anyone who needed to travel or make decisions about future plans. You begin to understand that medieval life required accepting uncertainty and adapting to changing conditions without reliable information about future developments. Medieval people lived with constant awareness that circumstances could change rapidly and dramatically. Planning beyond immediate needs was often impossible. As you approach your home village, you see familiar landmarks that represent safety and stability. Medieval local geography provided emotional comfort for people who had experienced the dangers and uncertainties of distant travel. Familiar surroundings meant predictable conditions and available support. The village church bells ring as you enter the village, and you realize that the sound represents the religious life that continues regardless of individual pilgrimage success or failure. Medieval Christianity was centered in local communities, where daily religious observances provided spiritual sustenance without requiring dangerous travel. Your family welcomes you home with joy and relief. Medieval families who sent members on dangerous journeys were never certain about successful returns. Your safe arrival was cause for celebration and gratitude to God for protection during travels. Your wife Marguerite asks about the pilgrimage, and you explain that survival was more important than reaching Santiago. Medieval practical wisdom recognized that preserving life was essential for fulfilling family responsibilities and continuing to serve God through daily activities. Your children listen to stories about the journey with fascination and fear. Medieval children learned about the wider world through traveler accounts that described both wonders and dangers beyond their village boundaries. Travel stories provided education about geography and human nature. You realize that your attempted pilgrimage taught valuable lessons about faith, courage, and the importance of making wise decisions under pressure. Medieval experiences often provided insights that were applicable to daily life challenges. Failed enterprises could still result in personal growth and wisdom. The village priest, Father Bernard, listens to your account and assures you that sincere pilgrimage attempts have spiritual value even when circumstances prevent completion. Medieval religious authorities understood that pilgrimage was about spiritual journey rather than geographic destination. God recognized sincere efforts and faithful intentions even when worldly circumstances prevented achieving specific goals. Your willingness to risk everything for faith demonstrates the spiritual commitment that God values most highly, Father Bernard explains. Many pilgrims who reach Santiago learn less about themselves and their faith than you learned during your dangerous journey home. Medieval Christianity emphasized that spiritual growth came through facing challenges with faith and courage, rather than through simply completing religious rituals. Your attempted pilgrimage provided opportunities for spiritual development that safe, easy journeys couldn't offer. You spend the following weeks returning to normal village life and readjusting to the routines and responsibilities you left behind. Medieval reintegration after travel required time because travelers had to readjust to familiar environments that seemed different after experiencing broader world perspectives. Your experience helps other villagers understand the realities of medieval travel and the wisdom of appreciating local safety and stability. Medieval travel stories served educational functions by teaching community members about conditions beyond their immediate experience. Thomas the Miller returns to the village 2 weeks after your arrival. His decision to abandon the pilgrimage proves wise because he learns that the bandit situation worsened after your group separated. Medieval practical decisions often prevented disasters that weren't apparent when the decisions were made. Robert and Agnes also return safely and report that they encountered no serious problems during their journey home. Medieval group travel provided safety benefits, even for return journeys, because familiar routes and destinations reduced navigation difficulties and security risks. Jean and Isabel send word that they completed their pilgrimage successfully by waiting for merchant caravan protection. Medieval patient strategies often succeeded when aggressive approaches failed. Their success validates the wisdom of choosing safety over speed during dangerous travel conditions. Brother Antoine remains at the monastery and sends occasional letters describing his work and spiritual growth. Medieval monastery life provided alternatives to secular careers for people who discovered religious vocations during travel experiences. Some pilgrims found their true calling while attempting journeys to distant shrines. William completes his pilgrimage and sends news of his safe arrival in Santiago de Compostela. Medieval successful pilgrims often maintained correspondence with people they met during their journeys because shared hardships created lasting friendships that transcended geographic distances. Your attempted pilgrimage becomes part of village history and provides lessons for future generations about the realities of medieval travel. Medieval communities preserved important experiences through oral traditions that educated young people about life beyond village boundaries. The village children ask repeatedly for stories about your journey, especially the dangerous parts involving bandits and wolves. Medieval children were fascinated by adventure stories that described experiences they were unlikely to have themselves, but needed to understand for future reference. Your wife Marguerite expresses relief that practical wisdom prevailed over religious ambition when survival became uncertain. Medieval women often had different perspectives on risk-taking because they bore primary responsibility for maintaining families when men undertook dangerous activities. "I'm grateful you chose to come home rather than die for spiritual goals," Marguerite explains. "Dead husbands can't provide for their families or teach their children. Your family needs you alive more than God needs you dead in some distant forest." Medieval family perspectives on pilgrimage often emphasized practical considerations over religious benefits, because families suffered direct consequences when pilgrimage attempts resulted in death or financial ruin. Religious authorities might encourage pilgrimage, but families paid the costs of failure. Your son Pierre, whose recovery from fever inspired your pilgrimage vow, grows into a healthy, active child. Medieval children who survived serious illnesses often became symbols of divine mercy and parental dedication. Pierre's continued health validates your religious commitment even though the pilgrimage wasn't completed. Years pass, and your attempted pilgrimage becomes a formative experience that influences your approach to faith, family, and community responsibilities. Medieval life experiences provided lessons that shaped entire lifetime perspectives about what was truly important and valuable. You develop a deeper appreciation for ordinary village life and the safety it provides compared to the dangers of distant travel. Medieval people who experienced travel dangers often became advocates for local stability and community solidarity because they understood how precious security was. Your travel experience makes you a valuable advisor for other villagers who consider undertaking pilgrimages or other long-distance journeys. Medieval experienced travelers served important community functions by sharing practical knowledge about route conditions, equipment needs, and survival strategies. The village priest occasionally asks you to speak with young men who have unrealistic ideas about pilgrimage being romantic adventure rather than dangerous survival challenge. Medieval reality education helped prevent unnecessary deaths by teaching people about actual conditions they would face during travel. Your children grow up with realistic understanding of medieval world conditions because your travel stories provide education about life beyond village safety. Medieval children who understood travel dangers were better prepared to make wise decisions about their own future activities and risk assessment. The bandit problems that prevented your pilgrimage completion gradually improve as local lords organize effective military campaigns against criminal groups. Medieval security conditions fluctuated over time, and areas that were dangerous during one period could become safe during subsequent years. Some villagers successfully complete pilgrimages to Santiago during later years when security improves and economic conditions provide better travel resources. Medieval pilgrimage opportunities varied significantly based on political stability, economic prosperity, and seasonal factors that changed from year to year. Your attempted pilgrimage inspires other forms of religious devotion that don't require dangerous travel. Medieval Christianity offered multiple paths to spiritual development, and local religious activities could provide meaningful alternatives to distant pilgrimage when travel was impractical or impossible. The village church receives additional donations and volunteer support as community members focus their religious energy on local institutions rather than distant shrines. Medieval community religious life often strengthened when external pilgrimage became difficult because people redirected their spiritual commitment toward accessible activities. You participate in village religious festivals and holy day observances with deeper appreciation for their spiritual significance. Medieval local religious traditions provided regular opportunities for spiritual growth and community bonding that didn't require risking life through dangerous travel. Your family prospers during the years following your attempted pilgrimage because you remain home to manage your farm and participate in village economic activities. Medieval families often achieved better economic outcomes when adult members focused on local opportunities rather than pursuing distant adventures. The money you would have spent completing the pilgrimage is invested in agricultural improvements and family security that provide long-term benefits. Medieval economic decisions about resource allocation often favored practical investments over spiritual expenditures when families had limited resources. Your children receive better education and preparation for adult life because you're present to provide guidance and support during their formative years. Medieval parenting required continuous presence and involvement because children faced numerous dangers and needed constant supervision and instruction. Marguerite expresses continuing gratitude that your family remained intact despite the temptation to pursue spiritual goals that could have destroyed family stability. Medieval women understood that family security depended on practical decisions that prioritized survival over abstract religious benefits. Other wives in the village became widows because their husbands chose spiritual adventure over family responsibility. Marguerite observes, You chose wisely when you decided that providing for your living family was more important than seeking distant blessings. Medieval family economics required careful balance between religious obligations and practical necessities. Families that prioritized spiritual activities over economic stability often suffered poverty and hardship that affected multiple generations. Your village develops a reputation for practical wisdom regarding pilgrimage decisions because several residents successfully completed religious journeys while others made wise decisions to abandon dangerous attempts. Medieval community reputations were based on collective decision-making patterns that demonstrated shared values and priorities. Visiting pilgrims often stop in your village to seek advice about route conditions and survival strategies. Medieval information networks relied on experienced travelers who could provide current intelligence about changing conditions along pilgrimage routes. Your advice to other pilgrims emphasizes careful planning, adequate resources, and willingness to abandon journeys when conditions become too dangerous. Medieval pilgrimage guidance focused on survival rather than spiritual inspiration, because survival was the prerequisite for achieving any religious benefits. Pilgrimage is about faith and commitment, not about reaching specific geographic destinations. You tell pilgrims who seek advice. God recognizes sincere efforts, even when worldly circumstances prevent completion of intended journeys. Medieval religious wisdom acknowledged that spiritual development could occur through attempting challenging activities, even when external factors prevented achieving original goals. Process was often more important than results in spiritual terms. Some pilgrims follow your advice and complete successful journeys by taking adequate precautions and making practical decisions about route changes and security measures. Medieval survival strategies could significantly improve pilgrimage success rates when travelers applied experienced guidance. Other pilgrims ignore practical advice and suffer consequences, including robbery, injury, illness, and death during their journeys. Medieval tragedy often resulted from ignoring experienced counsel in favor of optimistic assumptions about divine protection, overriding practical necessities. Your reputation as a wise advisor grows throughout the region as more travelers seek guidance about pilgrimage planning and route selection. Medieval expertise was recognized and valued because experienced knowledge could mean the difference between life and death during dangerous activities. The village benefits economically from increased traveler traffic because pilgrims who stop for advice often purchase supplies and pay for accommodation. Medieval communities that provided valuable services to travelers often developed economic advantages that improved local prosperity. Years later, when security conditions improve significantly, you consider attempting pilgrimage again with better preparation and resources. Medieval second attempts at difficult activities often succeeded when first attempts failed because experience provided valuable lessons about planning and execution. However, advancing age and increasing family responsibilities make long-distance travel less practical than during your younger years. Medieval life stage considerations often determined whether ambitious activities were feasible regardless of external conditions. Your eldest son, Henry, expresses interest in attempting pilgrimage when he reaches adulthood. Medieval pilgrimage traditions often passed between generations as younger family members sought to complete religious journeys that older relatives had attempted or planned. "I want to finish the journey you started," Henri explains. "Your attempt taught me about the importance of faith and courage. I want to honor your commitment by completing what circumstances prevented you from finishing." Medieval family religious traditions created connections between generations that honored previous efforts while adapting to new circumstances. Children often felt obligations to complete their parents' unfinished spiritual activities. You provide Henry with detailed advice about pilgrimage planning based on your experience and continued contact with other travelers. Medieval intergenerational knowledge transfer helped younger people avoid problems that had affected their predecessors while building on accumulated family wisdom. Henri's pilgrimage preparation includes physical conditioning, financial planning, and spiritual preparation that reflects lessons learned from your experience. Medieval second-generation planning often succeeded where first-generation attempts failed because families learned from previous mistakes and developed better strategies. When Henry finally undertakes his pilgrimage several years later, he successfully reaches Santiago de Compostela and returns home safely. Medieval family pilgrimage completion provided spiritual satisfaction for entire families, even when only one member actually completed the physical journey. Henri's success validates your original pilgrimage commitment, while demonstrating that timing and preparation significantly influence outcomes of difficult activities. Medieval achievements often required multiple generations to accomplish because individual attempts might fail while family persistence eventually succeeded. Your attempted pilgrimage becomes part of family history that influences your descendants' understanding of faith, courage, and practical wisdom. Medieval family traditions preserved important lessons through stories that educated future generations about life challenges and appropriate responses. The village remembers your pilgrimage attempt as an example of how practical wisdom and religious faith can coexist when people face difficult decisions about competing obligations. Medieval community memory preserved examples of good decision-making that provided guidance for future generations facing similar challenges. Looking back on your experience, you realize that attempting pilgrimage taught valuable lessons about medieval life that wouldn't have been learned through staying safely at home. Medieval travel experiences provided education about human nature, social conditions, and survival strategies that broadened understanding beyond local perspectives. The friends you made during pilgrimage remain important throughout your life, even though the journey wasn't completed. Medieval relationships formed during shared hardships often lasted lifetimes because common struggles created bonds that transcended ordinary social connections. Your understanding of medieval Christianity deepens through recognizing that spiritual growth comes through facing challenges with faith rather than through completing specific religious activities. Medieval religious development often occurred through attempting difficult activities rather than through achieving predetermined goals. The practical skills you learned during pilgrimage serve you well in daily village life when you face problems that require quick thinking and resourceful solutions. Medieval survival skills were transferable between different situations because fundamental challenges of medieval life were similar regardless of specific circumstances. Your family's economic stability benefits from your decision to prioritize practical necessities over spiritual ambitions when circumstances required choosing between competing obligations. Medieval family success often depended on making wise decisions about resource allocation during critical moments. The village community respects your judgment about balancing religious commitment with family responsibility because your decision-making demonstrates wisdom about priorities that benefit both spiritual and practical concerns. Medieval social respect was earned through demonstrating good judgment about complex decisions that affected multiple people. Your story becomes part of village folklore that teaches future generations about the realities of medieval travel and the importance of making practical decisions even when pursuing spiritual goals. Medieval community education operated through preserving and sharing stories that contained important lessons about life challenges. As you grow older, you often reflect on how your attempted pilgrimage shaped your understanding of what truly matters in medieval life. Medieval perspective often developed through experiences that challenged assumptions and forced people to examine their priorities and values. Faith remains important throughout your life, but you understand that religious commitment can be expressed through daily activities and local community service, rather than only through dramatic gestures like long-distance pilgrimage. Medieval spirituality often found expression through ordinary activities, performed with extraordinary dedication. Your family thrives because you chose practical wisdom over romantic adventure when survival became uncertain. Medieval families that prioritized stability over excitement often achieved better outcomes because medieval life provided enough genuine challenges without seeking additional difficulties. The village benefits from your presence and contributions throughout the years following your attempted pilgrimage. Medieval communities needed experienced, wise residents who could provide leadership and guidance during difficult periods that required good judgment and practical solutions. Your attempted pilgrimage becomes a story about the harsh realities of medieval life and the wisdom required to navigate its challenges successfully. Medieval survival required understanding when to persist and when to retreat, when to take risks, and when to prioritize safety. The experience teaches you that medieval people needed extraordinary courage just to attempt activities that modern people take for granted. Medieval travel required facing dangers that would terrify contemporary travelers who have access to modern safety equipment, communication systems, and emergency services. You develop deep respect for medieval people who successfully completed long-distance pilgrimages despite facing obstacles that would stop most modern travelers. Medieval pilgrimage achievement represented triumph over conditions that tested human endurance, courage, and faith to their absolute limits. Your story reminds listeners that medieval life required constant vigilance against threats that could emerge without warning and destroy lives within hours or days. Medieval people lived with awareness that safety was temporary and survival required continuous attention to changing conditions. The attempted pilgrimage helps you understand why medieval people valued local communities so highly, and why they developed strong traditions of mutual support and cooperation. Medieval community solidarity was essential for survival because individual families couldn't cope with all the dangers and challenges they faced alone. Your experience demonstrates that medieval decision-making required balancing multiple competing considerations, including religious obligations, family responsibilities, economic necessities, and survival requirements. Medieval life rarely offered simple choices or clear-cut solutions to complex problems. The pilgrimage attempt teaches you that medieval people who survived and prospered were those who developed practical wisdom about when to take risks and when to choose safety. Medieval survival required good judgment about probability assessment and resource allocation under conditions of uncertainty and danger. Your story becomes a testament to the resilience and adaptability that medieval people needed to survive in a world that was far more dangerous and unpredictable than modern people can easily imagine. Medieval life required strength, courage, and wisdom that few contemporary people possess or need to develop. As your life continues in the village, you remain grateful for the safety and stability that allow your family to prosper without facing the extreme dangers that made pilgrimage so hazardous. Medieval appreciation for ordinary security developed through understanding how quickly safety could disappear and how difficult it was to recover from disasters. Your attempted pilgrimage becomes part of the village's collective memory about the realities of medieval travel and the wisdom of making practical decisions when pursuing spiritual goals. Medieval community wisdom accumulated through preserving and sharing experiences that taught important lessons about survival and success. The story serves as a reminder that medieval people faced choices and challenges that required extraordinary courage, faith, and practical wisdom to navigate successfully. Medieval life demanded qualities that modern people rarely need to develop because contemporary safety systems and support structures provide security that medieval people couldn't access. Your experience helps modern listeners understand why they wouldn't last a day on medieval pilgrimage routes. Medieval travel required physical endurance, survival skills, risk assessment abilities, and psychological resilience that contemporary people haven't developed because modern life doesn't require such capabilities. The attempted pilgrimage demonstrates that medieval people who survived dangerous activities were either extraordinarily skilled and prepared or extraordinarily lucky. Medieval survival often depended on factors beyond individual control, and wise people recognized the limitations of human agency in dangerous situations. Your story concludes with appreciation for modern conveniences and safety systems that make contemporary travel safe and comfortable compared to medieval alternatives. Medieval people would be amazed by modern transportation, communication, medical care, and emergency services that eliminate most dangers that made medieval travel so hazardous. The experience teaches modern listeners to value the security and comfort of contemporary life while respecting the courage and resilience of medieval people who accomplished remarkable things despite facing conditions that would defeat most modern travelers. Medieval achievements were extraordinary because they occurred under circumstances that modern people can barely imagine surviving. Your attempted pilgrimage becomes a window into medieval life that reveals both the harsh realities that medieval people faced daily and the remarkable human qualities they developed to cope with those realities. Medieval survival required strength, courage, wisdom, and faith that few contemporary people possess or understand. The story serves as a reminder that human civilization has progressed dramatically in terms of safety, comfort, and security, but that progress came at the cost of losing some of the resilience and practical wisdom that medieval people developed through necessity. Medieval life produced capabilities that modern life doesn't require, but might be valuable if contemporary safety systems ever failed. As we return to our comfortable modern beds with climate control, reliable electricity, clean water, emergency services, and countless other conveniences, we can appreciate both how far human civilization has progressed and how remarkable medieval people were for surviving and sometimes thriving under conditions that would quickly kill most contemporary people. Medieval pilgrimage was just one example of the extraordinary challenges that medieval people faced regularly and the remarkable courage they demonstrated by attempting to overcome those challenges. The attempted pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela reminds us that medieval people were not primitive or ignorant, but rather were intelligent, capable human beings who developed sophisticated strategies for surviving in a world that was far more dangerous and difficult than anything most modern people will ever experience. Their stories deserve our respect and admiration for their achievements under circumstances that we can barely imagine surviving. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in safety and comfort that medieval people could never have imagined, remember the courage and resilience of people like Guillaume, Marguerite, Thomas, Jean, Isabel, Robert, Agnes, and brother Antoine, who faced the harsh realities of medieval life with determination and faith that inspire us even across the centuries that separate their world from ours.